I've assessed hundreds of corporate executives for leadership skills, and now I'm rating the US presidents. My name is Mino, and I'm a leadership expert. I run my own consulting business advising CEOs and have trained thousands of people in leadership. Now, I'm ranking each president. In this video, I'll answer 4 questions. How does each US president's leadership rank? Using statistics, what's actually important for presidential performance? Using this data, is US leadership getting better or worse over time? What does the future of presidential leadership look like? But even more so, this is the story of how an unlikely experiment in the far corner of the world would go on to change history. How men in positions of authority brought out our best and our worst. How we fought and continue to fight for our ideals. This is a story of the United States as told through the lens of our leaders, the visionaries, the devils, and everything in between. Let's start with question number 1. How does each US president's leadership rank? We first need criteria, something to evaluate each president on. I found a few other projects that have done a similar task. So they had criteria like policy, appointments, political skill, party leadership, luck, etc. When I work with CEOs, we focus on how they're able to solve problems, how they learn and improve, how they build alliances and mobilize people, and how they influence change. Combining all of this and adapting it to a presidential context, I landed on 7 criteria to evaluate each president. But before I go any further, I want to make clear that I did my very best to rate each president apolitically. That means I try to take my personal politics out of it as much as possible. The overarching question is, was this a good leader? Regardless of how I feel about them, when I pick my criteria, some are easier to judge apolitically than others. For instance, 4 of my presidential criteria include vision, communication, integrity, crisis management. These are all easier to rate without wading into politics. The other 3 criteria I chose: national unity, foreign policy, and domestic policy. These are trickier because they're most often assessed through a political or ideological lens. My guiding light for these really tough decisions are, was this good for the country? And I tried my best not to let my personal feelings get in the way of ratings. I also would have really loved to add an 8th factor, presidential appointments, but I don't know enough to give an honest ratings. Picking the right team is a vital leadership skill, but I cannot in good faith say I know about Chester A. Arthur's cabinet. On that note, I am an expert in leadership, but I'm not a historian. I really love history, but because I'm not trained in history, I could very well be missing things. So please feel free to share what I'm missing in the comments. I rated each president on a 5-point scale for each of the 7 criteria, a score of 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. To try and standardize the ratings, I broke each criteria into behavioral anchors, which means if I were to be observing this person, what would I see them doing? For instance, if we take vision, I define a 1 in vision as blindly reacting to external events. They don't drive any proactive direction, and they miss environmental cues, and they don't change. I define a 3 in vision as a practical strategist. There's a mix of reacting to events and shaping them, but they lack a cohesive idea of what America can be. I define a 5 in vision as they have situational awareness to move the country in a new and needed direction, and they can create a compelling narrative of American idealism. Here's the crux of what great presidential leadership should look like behaviorally. They create a compelling positive narrative of a new future. They inspire and move the public through communication. They're a civic role model and law-abiding. They adapt and respond decisively to the moment. They fight for the good of all citizens. They create safety through cooperation and strength, and they recreate the systems and structures of the nation. The opposite of this, aka bad leadership, would be they're helpless and reactive with no sense of direction. There's no common narrative, which creates chaos of voices. They're selfish, corrupt, and break laws, which weakens trust. They have a rigid ideology, which stops a response to the moment. They have favoritism, which leads to separation and infighting. They allow foreign players to determine our future, and they let the country decay and atrophy. Rather than bore you with reading each and every one of these criteria in detail, I'm going to show them now. Pause the video if you want to read through the details. And if you feel like I'm getting too political in my ratings, please return back to these criteria and read the behavioral anchors again. I'm going to be going in chronological order, starting with Washington and ending with Obama. I feel like we really need at least 20 years to truly understand the president's impact and to get access to all the behind-the-scenes information. So even including Obama is pushing it at this point. I've chosen not to rate or rank presidents that held power for less than 2 years. You need to have served at least the majority of one term to have made the cut. This means in total, I'll be rating and ranking 40 US presidents. I'll be sharing their numerical score or rating that I gave each president. I'll be sharing their rank, and then I'll be comparing it to the Siena College historian rankings. Also, because we're Americans, I made sure there are no ties. Whenever I had a tie in my rankings or ratings, I went through and manually did tiebreakers. I'll be using political eras to frame these ratings. Each political era in the US tends to be framed by a visionary leader. These leaders kind of create the matrix that we live in until a new vision recreates our reality. That's why you tend to see politicians from different parties sort of converge on an ideology. And so I'll be using this to see how these visionaries frame our system. Let's start with the first party system. The first party system was framed by two visionaries. Lucky for us, we have George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. For much of our early history, their competing visions marked the early clashes in the nation. The Federalists, which was more in the vein of George Washington, argued for a strong national government, and they wanted a national bank and a strong economic and industrial system. The Democratic Republicans, which was more in Jefferson's vibe, argued for a limited government with greater emphasis on farmers and states' rights. Let's put the first party system in a bit of context. After independence, the United States adopted the Articles of Confederation, which was a very decentralized form of federal government. Basically, the states were going to run like independent countries. And what we found is that it didn't work. We needed a way to respond to crisis. When crisis hit, there was no way to organize and take decisive action. So the US Constitution was actually our second form of government, and in large part was a reaction and a response to not having enough leadership to respond to crisis events. So this is the trend. We're strengthening the government, we're strengthening the executive, and we have a president. George Washington comes in and relies heavily on Alexander Hamilton to create a federal system of government. So the first party, the Federalists, was largely in the vein of Washington, of Hamilton, and wanting to create this kind of national bureaucracy, national infrastructure to run the nation. In opposition to that was Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, who wanted to go very hard into laissez-faire, basically to continuously weaken the national government, to weaken the power of the executive. So they were much more into the decentralization of the nation. So this is largely the clash of the first party system. So let's get to the rankings and ratings. George Washington. I personally tend to weirdly discount Washington. He wrote the book and set a strong precedent that still forms our expectations 200 years later. He made sure we had a functioning republic and kept a deeply divided nation together, basically through the strength of his own will. We now know that the division between the North and the South was enough to create a civil war. And part of the reason it took so long to get there is because Washington had a very clear vision and deep loyalty to national unity. As chief executive, he kept the young nation out of war, quelled a rebellion, established the infrastructure for the federal government. He had no scandals and catered little to special interests. The big knock on Washington, as is going to be for much of our early presidents, is his advocacy and participation in slavery. Holding people in bondage against their will, profiting off their coerced labor. It's both a negative to his personal integrity and to the cause of national unity. Unity means we don't pick favorites. We're trying to be in service of everyone in the nation. And clearly slavery is as far as imaginable from being the ideal of unity. On a scale of 1 to 5, George Washington scores a 4.21. Siena College historians rank him at number 3, and my rating puts him at number 4. That's enough to put him in the S tier, and we're pretty damn lucky that we're starting off this way. John Adams. I find John Adams to be a truly unremarkable leader. My sense is that all he tried to do was maintain a status quo that was pretty much handed to him. He's also characterized as being vain and emotional, with trouble explaining himself or influencing others. He was in constant reaction mode and was even dragged into a quasi-war. By far, the worst part of Adams' legacy is the Alien and Sedition Acts, which he used to target opposition newspapers. It's a pretty big betrayal of the core values of the US, and it came early enough in our history that it could have jeopardized the entire project. The one place Adams does get high marks is his personal character. He had no corruption, no scandals, and I do think he genuinely wanted what's best for the US. For his forgettable leadership, John Adams gets a score of 2.5 out of 5. While historians have him at 16, I actually rank him at 27, which is an 11 spot difference. And this is a good case study. This is where leadership often differs from history. For his lackluster performance, Adams is in the D tier. Sorry, buddy. Thomas Jefferson. Some of the presidents are just absolute devils to rate because they have so many contradictions, and Thomas Jefferson is one of those devils. Jefferson was truly a visionary, and his vision is so interwoven into all facets of US government that it continues to be a strong part of the American ethos. Jefferson remade the country in his image. He was also one of the most prolific and profound communicators in our nation's history. Love him or hate him, he is and continues to be a dominant force in the American consciousness. In these aspects, he was truly brilliant. But he was also a political hack, deeply partisan, and he managed to even piss off George Washington, which is quite the accomplishment. He created animosity with Great Britain and sowed the seeds of future crises. In short, he was quite irresponsible, always taking sides and splitting people rather than unifying them. He was also all about that slavery life and deeply committed to minority rule. On the domestic side, most of his effort was dedicated to dismantling George Washington's infrastructure. So what do we make of this brilliant, visionary, petty, manipulative chaos maker? Thomas Jefferson's leadership gets a 3.64. While historians currently rank him at number 5, this score, for me, puts him at number 8 on my list, which ultimately is still A tier. For all his awful hypocrisy, he was overall a good leader for the country at that time, but he's no role model of mine. James Madison. James Madison was handpicked by Thomas Jefferson to continue the laissez-faire project. But Madison soon realized that pragmatism must outweigh idealism. He continuously strayed from Jefferson's rigid ideals. Adaptability, as we're going to see, is a great leadership trait. So as crises unfolded, Madison began to strengthen the government and eventually strengthen the military. He ended up reinstalling a lot of the Washington-Hamilton government infrastructure. He had no major corruption and no major scandals. But on the other hand, we also have another bona fide slaver as president. He was also a pretty big asshole to minority groups, including Native Americans. He allowed himself to get bullied in foreign affairs with Europe. He tried brinkmanship, failed, and then launched a mediocre war. All in all, Madison just comes off as mid. Allowing himself to adapt and be pragmatic is his greatest strength as a leader, but he had little imagination and was often reacting to events. For his performance, James Madison gets a 3.18. Historians have him at 10, and I've got him at 14, which puts him squarely in the B tier. James Monroe. Monroe is another hand-picked candidate to carry out the Jeffersonian legacy. But whereas Madison was a bit pragmatic, Monroe was much more dogmatic. He stuck to his ideals even when they didn't make a whole lot of sense. He really thought of himself as a constitutional purist and basically refused to respond to any crisis events. He couldn't work with Congress at all. So under his term, partisanship increased quite a bit. He continuously punted the ball on important matters like slavery, which would start to pave the long road to the Civil War. He, of course, was a slaver as well. One area that historians give Monroe credit for is the Monroe Doctrine, which forbade European powers from meddling in Latin America. Of our early presidents, Monroe was perhaps the most adept in foreign policy. All of this lands James Monroe with a score of 3.00, which is truly an utterly average leader. What's crazy to me is that historians rank him at number 12. I hope someone can explain that to me because I have him at 19, which, my dear chap, is C tier. John Quincy Adams. Are you ready for the sequel? Unlike his father, Quincy Adams came in with a solid vision for the nation. He had an agenda and he wanted to create a national infrastructure which includes having public universities. He was considered a great writer and is the first president to vocally challenge the institution of slavery. He was considered a very good diplomat in foreign relations and largely steered the US in a more isolationist direction. He faced little crisis and so was untested in that form of leadership. The problem? Quincy Adams was ushered into power by the corrupt bargain which removed all his legitimacy, and he had no mandate. So he actually got very little done or passed through the Congress. While he talked the talk, he could not walk the walk, and his gambit for power stained his legacy. John Quincy Adams' leadership gets a 2.71. Historians have him ranked at 17, which I just don't understand. I rank him at 24, which is the bottom of C tier. The second party system. With the second party system, a great realignment occurs of the parties, which would reframe politics for the next 30 years. And you're going to notice we're moving away from the kind of federalist, we want a national government, and we're moving away from the Jeffersonian, we have a decentralized government, to a complete rearrangement of the parties. In the corrupt bargain, John Quincy Adams essentially stole the presidency, and he stole it from Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson comes in and remakes politics in his image. Jackson's Democrats mobilize poor people, and he gives rise to populist politics. So they really believe in a strong executive. And instead of appointments, they want to elect judges. And they also are really big advocates of manifest destiny, which is the westward expansion. By contrast, the main opposition voice becomes Henry Clay and the Whigs. The Whigs had support amongst entrepreneurs, professionals, and the urban middle class. The Whigs are largely framed in reaction to Andrew Jackson. So they want to restrict executive power, they don't want westward expansion, and they believe in high tariffs to increase U.S. industry. And ultimately, it's during this party system that we take the long march towards the Civil War. And so this party system is very important, so we see how we go from the birth of our nation to the nation splitting in two and actually going to war with itself. So let's get into it. Andrew Jackson. So with Andrew Jackson, we've got another devil on our hands. And you'll notice that this is where equally weighing leadership criteria just doesn't feel right at times. So that's what I chose to do with this project, is I weighted every leadership criteria the same. Vision is worth the same amount as national unity, is worth the same amount as communication. That's where a very complicated leadership image can appear. Andrew Jackson stirred populist sentiment, but he doesn't really have a cohesive vision. So he generally reacted based on his instincts. He has a solid foreign policy record, which includes negotiating good deals with foreign powers, and he did expand the vote, which allowed for white male suffrage, so all white males could now vote. And this is the first big step away from aristocratic oligopoly to something resembling the ideals of a democracy. On the other hand, Jackson was a genocidal maniac, and he placed himself above the courts and the law. We honestly have yet to reconcile and heal from the atrocities he committed against the indigenous First Nations. Jackson instituted a spoil system, which essentially legalized bribery and corruption. He took money out of the national bank and then sent it to his party-friendly pet banks. For the record, it would be almost 100 years before this bribery and corruption could be eliminated from government again. I ardently believe that Jackson was a bad leader and bad for the nation. While he set a couple positive precedents, such as expanding the vote and responding forcefully when South Carolina tried to secede from the Union, his contempt for law and order, being pro-slavery, pro-genocide, pro-corruption, fills me with disgust. Remember when I said that great visionaries set the frame and shaped the collective narrative for the political era? Well, I kind of lied. Visionaries most often create our shared reality, but there's another archetype of leader that can forcefully move us into a new political era, and that is the great reactionary. Andrew Jackson was that great reactionary, coming in blazing hot with reactive instincts. Through sheer will, Jackson reshapes American consciousness and starts the slow descent towards separation and civil war. For his really all over the place leadership, Andrew Jackson gets a rating of 2.57. Historians rank him at 22, and I have him at 26, which is our D tier. Martin Van Buren. Oh, Marty. Martin Van Buren was essentially a continuation of Jackson's administration, but with less sex appeal. He didn't have his own vision for the country, and he continued genocidal policies against indigenous peoples of America, something he does not get held accountable for at all. He failed to respond to a banking crisis and stayed more loyal to an ideology than adapting to the situation at hand. The economy was depressed for 5 years. The only positives that can differentiate Van Buren from Jackson is that Van Buren ran a highly efficient cabinet and largely stayed out of corruption. For his mediocrity and continuation of atrocities, Martin Van Buren gets a score of 2.32. Historians have put him at 27, and I have him at 31. He joins his friend Andrew Jackson in the D tier. William Henry Harrison. This is our first Whig president, but he dies too quick. Sorry, buddy, you are skipped. John Tyler. Oh, John Tyler. He is the first vice president to succeed a president upon their death. And he comes off as truly clueless. Zero vision, zero mandate. His own party rejected him, landing him in a political no man's land where all he did was veto bills. He was in a total deadlock with Congress. I also didn't mention yet that he was super pro-slavery. Honestly, the only positive I can say about him is that he didn't have a lot of corruption. John Tyler gets a score of 2.11. Historians rank him at 36, and I have him at 33, which is still towards the bottom of D tier. We continue our regularly scheduled program with James Polk. Polk comes out as super solid, which after years of mismanagement comes off as a breath of fresh air. His top priority was acquiring more land out west. So whether you like Manifest Destiny or not, the fact is Polk had some vision and he executed it. He successfully managed the Mexican-American War, and he was really held up as a moral man of high integrity, and he was willing to fight machine politics and corruption. He did also own slaves. And of course, westward expansion would eventually exacerbate the debate over slavery, and it also led to massacres of Native American populations. While he did lay the groundwork for these crises, they technically didn't happen on his watch, and some of this didn't also happen directly because of him. All in all, he's considered competent, which again is quite favorable for that time. For his solid, all-around competent leadership, I'm giving James Polk a score of 3.46. Historians rank him at 15, and I've got him at 11, which places him at the bottom of A tier. Zachary Taylor. So we get another Whig president, but he also dies too early. Whig presidents just keep dying on us. So instead, we get Millard Fillmore. With the death of Taylor, we've got another vice president that takes the big seat. Fillmore, by all measures, is very forgettable. But we are on the march to the Civil War. So we really need to study the 10 years of leadership that led to that catastrophe, and that starts with Fillmore. Like John Tyler, he never articulated a vision. This is a recurring theme. When a vice president takes over after death or resignation, they've either got no time or have no skills in creating and articulating a vision. Of course, we could say it's unfair to expect them to lead millions overnight, but that's what's required. He does get solid points for his foreign policy, where he was a functional game time manager. He protected U.S. interests in Hawaii and Cuba, and he also opened Japan to the U.S. On the other hand, he played a lot of politics with cabinet replacements. And despite being personally opposed to slavery, he went pretty damn hard on enacting the Fugitive Slave Act. Just a friendly reminder, the Fugitive Slave Act was a brutal practice in which the federal government rounded up escaped men, women, and children and return them to slavers in the South. So at a time when polarization is increasing, it really hurts to have an incompetent leader. For his mediocre tenure, Millard Fillmore gets a score of 2.36. Historians rank him at 35, and I have him at 30, which puts him squarely in D territory. Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce might be one of the most batshit insane presidents we've had. It's like every instinct in him was driving division, polarization, and war. He had zero imagination and created no forward momentum, and he basically inflamed every single issue that he touched. He was an awful communicator and couldn't explain his decisions, which honestly were often terrible as it is. His idea, and I shit you not, of unity was to fill his cabinet with extremists from both parties. So like he would take the staunchest slavers and the staunchest abolitionists and then just have them tear each other apart without intervening. While he made some foreign policy agreements and he completed the Gadsden Purchase, he also managed to botch the acquisition of Cuba. He was utterly inept at reining in corruption and was an active alcoholic while in office. And as if this wasn't enough, he openly fanned the flames of war in the Kansas Territory. He was super pro-slavery, and he nullified the Compromise of 1820, which were the catalysts of the Civil War. The guy created tons of chaos and conflict, openly took sides, and had a huge hand in destroying the country that he was supposed to be leading. For his horrible, horrible job, Franklin Pierce gets a score of 1.43. Historians rank him at number 37, and I have him at number 38. It's hard to imagine that there is worse than him, but oh boy, you just wait. Franklin Pierce, you are our first F for your catastrophic leadership. James Buchanan. After Franklin Pierce, it can't get much worse, right? Right? Wrong. Oh, James Buchanan. Let's go. All right, so Buchanan inherited a mess. I'll give him that, technically. But from there, all he managed to do was just fuck it up even more. He had absolutely no vision at all, and he was purely reactive to events as they unfolded. He was also just not fun to work with. He managed to piss off everyone around him. He was truly incompetent in foreign policy and failed at every attempt to get an international agreement done. And of course, he was also truly incompetent in the face of any and every crisis, where he took no action at all. But wait, it can only get worse from here. There was active corruption and bribery all over his cabinet. The guy went out of his way to secretly lobby Supreme Court justices to influence the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott is considered the worst decision in Supreme Court history, holding that U.S. Constitution did not extend American citizenship to any people of Black African descent, including free people in the North. And Buchanan was behind the scenes, putting pressure to get the Supreme Court justices to switch their opinions toward this egregious ruling. Like, this had such an immediate backlash that the stock market crashed and the east-west railroads immediately went bankrupt, which caused several runs on large banks. It goes without saying that Buchanan was pro-slavery, but he even went as far to tell the South it had a right to secede from the Union. So the guy in charge of upholding the Union told half of it could fuck off and leave. So yeah, want to know how a civil war begins? Playing hardcore favorites, not being a leader for the whole nation, and flaming emotions at the most primal level. We're talking about the right to freedom and bodily autonomy, to basic human fairness. Instead, we got lying and cheating and active disdain for checks and balances. I imagine some of you might have questioned why I included the national unity leadership capability. Whether you're a CEO or a president, lack of unity creates factions, conflict, and even war. Once the seeds of division are planted, fear waters the dark plant. Fear in its many forms, anxiety, control, greed, rage, they all end up in the same place. Buchanan is the logical conclusion to Jacksonian democracy. What started with genocide and the expansion of slavery ended with the ownership class killing each other. The system finds a way to make a balance. When we ask for blood, we pay with blood. If nothing else, and I'll put this in super selfish and pragmatic terms, unity holds us together and keeps us from killing each other. Look, I think most of us can agree that life is not fair, and we must all learn to tolerate various levels of unfairness. But as a leader, we should strive to reduce the man-made, artificial differences that exacerbate conflict. E pluribus unum. Remember that motto? We've been using it since 1776. Out of many, one. This is the job of leadership. And in that, a long list of presidents failed. For his role in jump-starting the Civil War, James Buchanan gets a score of 1.14. Historians have him ranked at 39, and I have him dead last at number 40. Congratulations, you bozo, you're the worst leader in U.S. history. The worst president, he gets an F. The third party system. The seeds of division have blossomed into full-blown civil war. I feel like we don't talk enough about how crazy she has to get to reach a full-blown civil war. Shane Gillis has a joke. Imagine how racist you have to be to wake up one morning and start walking from Alabama all the way to Maryland just to get shot right away. The Civil War is where loyalty to slavery was greater than loyalty to nation or family. Brothers killing brothers. In terms of political parties, this is the beginning of a true North versus South geographic divide, the legacy of which we still live with today. The newly formed Republicans dominate this period. In addition to abolishing slavery, they adopt many Whig-style programs to modernize the nation. And this is quite important. Modernization means that they choose to juice national banks, railroads, have high tariffs, have homesteads, and even socially spend on Civil War veteran pension funding. Yes, the government helps our civilization invest in and move in a common direction. So because of the Republicans, welcome to the era of extreme industrial and economic expansion. Abraham Lincoln. It's the one and only, the GOAT, Abraham. Lincoln is the most studied president of all time, so I'm going to try and keep it simple here. Lincoln comes into office with an incredibly strong vision. He saw the potential for the U.S. and held together the Union through his sheer will. He routinely saw our better angels and fused this incredible sense of accountability with compassion and forgiveness. He is one of our top orators and writers. His work is held equal to the Founding Fathers. And in a way, he is the founding father after the nation is split in two. Lincoln finally unearths the rot that's in the United States and starts to clean the soul of the nation. He spent his entire presidency managing severe crisis after severe crisis, all while navigating an unwieldy coalition with many opposing voices. Lincoln didn't focus as much on foreign policy, but I mean, who can blame the guy? He was managing a civil war. He did manage to keep Britain and France from supporting the traitorous Confederacy, so there's that. And of course, Lincoln wins the war. He ends slavery. And he retools the entire US system. He also has a strong post-war vision to support black citizens, reintegrate the South, and to go about reconstruction. In the moment this nation needed him most, Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed. One of the great what-ifs of history. What would our country look like if we had his leadership during reintegration and healing? Leadership matters. We place in one person the responsibility to set our direction, to unify us, to make sure we're all going the same way. But the forces of fear took us on a different path. As a visionary, great communicator, unifier, compassionate, fair, and determined leader, Abraham Lincoln receives a score of 4.57. Historians have him at number 2, but come on, man, he's the GOAT. Number 1 all the way. He is truly S-tier material. Andrew Johnson. Lincoln was so committed to national unity that he actually ran on a national unity ticket. So while he was a Republican, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, was a Democrat from Tennessee. Johnson becomes the third vice president to prematurely be promoted to the Oval Office. And like the two vice presidents before him, he immediately screws it up. Unfortunately, he's tasked with a gargantuan cleanup effort, piecing together a nation that had just been at war with itself. Johnson had no vision at all. He reportedly could not read people to save his life and could not communicate effectively. He failed in every foreign policy attempt and did not accomplish anything. He refused to respond to crisis, was considered self-absorbed, and totally lacking in character. Unsurprisingly, a Southern Democrat, he did not care at all for black citizens who had just gained their freedom. I feel like we don't talk about this enough. Imagine having generation upon generation enslaved. There's limited to no access to basic education, and all of a sudden you're thrust into freedom, but without any support or resources whatsoever. Where the hell do you go? What do you do? You're in actively hostile territory amongst people that are actively dehumanizing you and want to re-enslave you. You have no money, no property, nothing. This could have been the role of Reconstruction, to provide at least some basic assistance to black Americans, but there was never any compensation, never any real support. Just a shrug and, well, good luck now. Johnson allowed the South to pass the Black Codes, which might as well be called slavery by another name. The Black Codes restricted black people's right to own property, conduct business, buy and lease land, and move freely through the public space. A central element of the Black Codes was vagrancy laws. States criminalized men who were out of work who were not working a job that whites recognized. While Congress did create the Freedmen's Bureau to support newly freed people, it received no direct funding and only controlled a very small portion of land. And when the Bureau was up for renewal, Johnson vetoed it. All in all, Johnson almost destroys any chances of Reconstruction. Imagine fighting a 5-year war with millions of casualties, and the moment it's all over, the winner empowers the slave-owning losers to immediately start up their bullshit again. Johnson was so antagonistic against Congress that they repeatedly had to override his vetoes to get some semblance of legislation passed. The North may have won the war, but because of Johnson, the South won history. For his neglect, incompetence, and antagonism, for throwing away our one chance at healing and making right hundreds of years of vile supremacy and dehumanization, Johnson gets a score of 1.21. Historians have him last at 40, and I have him at 39. He goes to F right away. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is the hero of the Civil War, the general that kicked some traitor ass and won it all. But he's often considered a weak president, so what gives? This is even weirder considering he won re-election by almost 12% and was the only president to serve 2 full consecutive terms between Andrew Jackson in 1828 and Woodrow Wilson in 1912. So let's take a look at the facts. Grant was not an exceptional communicator. You won't find many Instagram quotes or hype videos attributed to old Ulysses. He was also more or less a game time manager in foreign affairs and did not rock the boat. So far, pretty average. Okay, but we're still fresh off the Civil War, the assassination of Lincoln, and the terrible presidency of Johnson. So what does Grant actually do? Grant comes in with a very strong vision. He is going to enforce Reconstruction and guide the nation to real unity. In essence, he wants to remake the country so that it works in everyone's favor. It is in Grant that we see massive civil rights victories, the likes of which we would not see again for almost 100 years. He is the first president to have real intentions to improve the lives of Native Americans and appoints the first indigenous person to the United States government. He also absolutely dominates and crushes the KKK. In doing so, we see a wave of black politicians and legislators emerge as leaders in their local and state communities. To my knowledge, Grant is the first sitting president to publicly favor the women's suffrage movement. We shamefully haven't touched on this topic yet, but yeah, 50% of the population is deemed unworthy of having a voice in the governance of society. And Grant was the one that wanted to change that. So Grant is the one to lend his support to women's rights. Grant is also one of the first ones to believe in the conservation of nature. So it is in Grant that we see some semblance of unity after the Civil War and the rapid recognition of humanity in huge segments of our population. Grant was also adept at responding to national crises as they unfolded. He's considered to have high personal integrity and made a legitimate effort to reform the government and uproot corruption. Honestly, if you're any kind of liberal leftist, you should be absolutely salivating over this guy. Grant, in short, was pretty based. So what gives? Why the hell do historians rank this guy 20 out of 40? And herein lies the rub. Spoiler alert, after Grant, the South engages in a massive propaganda campaign and manages to rewrite history. The lost cause myth was propagated by racists to justify their betrayal of their nation. Somehow, the South is cast in this romantic light and slavers are made out to be heroes. Oh, we're just fighting for sweet Virginia, my wife, my horse, and my 2 boys. Look, this topic is way too big to tackle in this video, but it's important to see how the stories we choose to tell and the vibes we associate with leaders can influence how we perceive and portray them. Of course, Grant needs to be vilified and cast out of the narrative if you're racist. He's the general who won the war and the president that expanded rights and privileges, shattering the rigid hierarchies of the aristocratic South. Lincoln may have had a vision, but Grant goddamn saw it through. For slavers and racists, Grant is the devil incarnate. And so when we let them tell the story, he's going to be cast as one. The main knock on Grant and what they try to take him down for is corruption in his administration. But when I look into it, it just doesn't add up. Grant was naive about finance and Wall Street, which for a military man, I find understandable. His biggest fault, if any, is that he's a bad judge of character. He was an accepting man that saw the positives in people. And yes, he did appoint some people who committed corruption, but upon finding out, he immediately fired them. Other than vet people more carefully, what else do we expect of him? It's as if at this time period we're not still smack dab in the middle of spoil system, the legacy of Andrew Jackson. Nah, this feels like a hit campaign, good and simple. And this is where I think the modern political left needs to do much better. Yes, there is merit in framing slavers and traitors in their proper context. We don't need to be worshiping Robert E. Lee and Nathan Bedford Forrest, but we can also uphold positive examples of leadership. And I think people want that and they need that. And there are positive role models in history we can look to for inspiration and hope. Leaders like Ulysses S. Grant. We should remember Ulysses Grant. We should celebrate Ulysses Grant. He was a damn good leader whose legacy is worth upholding as a positive example. Don't let bigoted losers rewrite history. For his vision, courage, and execution, Ulysses S. Grant gets a score of 3.93. Historians have him at number 20, but for me, that score places him at number 6, which is S tier. I genuinely do not think we could tell the story of the United States without him included. And if we tried, we would be failing. Rutherford B. Hayes. Oh, the twists and turns of history. On the back of Grant, the champion of Reconstruction, who do we get? In the election of 1876, both Rutherford B. Hayes and his opponent Samuel Tilden failed to get enough electoral votes to win the election. In the infamous Compromise of 1877, Hayes cuts a backroom deal with the South. He agrees to end Reconstruction and remove the U.S. military presence that was keeping the peace. The crazy part is Hayes was not only a Northern Republican, but he spent his entire career a staunch abolitionist. So the guy went from promoting the rights of Black Americans to handing over their future to their former slavers. Talk about selling your soul for power. And what did Mr. Hayes do with that power, you may ask? Well, nothing. He had no forward vision for the nation and simply reacted to events. He had no real foreign policy agenda, nor any real domestic policy agenda. He only managed to exacerbate crises in the South, which he allowed to transform into a racial police state. His election ushered in Jim Crow, legalizing segregation and voter suppression. New paramilitary units rose to enforce this new police state order. Crimes were invented to force innocent citizens back into a form of brutal slavery. And Hayes looked on apathetically. This former staunch abolitionist watching the entire Lincoln Grant project get flushed down the toilet. And then during a railroad strike, he ordered the military to kill workers. There's not that much more to say about this guy. He traded his soul for power and then did nothing of substance or value with that power. For his craven and destructive leadership, Rutherford B. Hayes gets a score of 1.86. Historians rank him at number 29, and I have him at 36. He also makes it into F tier. James Garfield. James Garfield was assassinated too early into his term to be rated. Sorry, bud. Chester A. Arthur. We have yet another vice president ascending to the Oval Office and do almost nothing. Do you sense a pattern yet? Chester A. Arthur had no compelling vision and spent his tenure reacting to events. He made no significant contribution in foreign policy, and thankfully, there were no real crises that he needed to respond to. Nor did he make any strides legislatively. One small bright spot is that despite being a machine politician, he did take on the spoil system and got legislation passed to curb corruption. Legislation passed during his administration was the beginning of the end for large-scale government corruption. But he did not support Black Americans during a wave of violence in the South. He was a pretty big asshole to Native Americans, and he also went pretty hard on being anti-immigration. Honestly, his biggest accomplishment might be getting referenced in the movie Die Hard. For his mediocre, drifting leadership, Chester A. Arthur gets a score of 1.93. Historians have him at 31, and I have him at 35. That is the bottom of D tier. Grover Cleveland, Part 1. Next up is Grover, who up until recently was the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. I'm going to review him here one time, even though his two terms were a bit different. Just for some context, we're now in the heart of the Gilded Age, a time of business monopolies, political corruption, immense wealth inequality, and pouring in of immigrants. This is where capitalism reaches its zenith. Grover Cleveland is a hard man to pin down. He had very little imagination and very little vision. He mostly reacted to events as they unfolded. He did not believe in Reconstruction and did not advocate for Black or Native Americans. And ideologically, he acted super libertarian. But then he would blatantly contradict himself. He was anti-imperialistic, but then intervened in Hawaii and South America. He ignored almost every crisis except when it came to helping out big businesses. So is he an ideologue, a pragmatist, someone who just has favoritism towards big business? I don't fully know what to make of him. But truly, his crowning achievement was being a corruption crusader. With high personal integrity, he took on political corruption and the spoils system. For his contradicting, sometimes effective, sometimes ineffective leadership, Cleveland gets a score of 2.86. Historians rank him at 25, and I have him at 22, which lands him in the C tier. Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison feels forgotten to history, which is deeply unfortunate because he may be one of our most important presidents. I'm being serious, hear me out. Benjamin Harrison created the template of the modern presidency. He changed and shaped the role into what we now think of and consider a president. He comes in with a pragmatic, progressive agenda. He was by no means a visionary, but he made big changes. He was quite a good orator and made fine speeches, and he took a much more active role in foreign negotiations, setting the table for a more active United States. This is the beginning of the end for American isolationism. A man of high integrity, he was the first to pass antitrust legislation and go after the monopolies. He was a staunch advocate for civil rights and nature conservation. When it comes to Native Americans, Harrison was an assimilationist. By the standards of his time, Harrison genuinely thought he was doing something right by the Native American populations. However, today we see the era's assimilationist policies as really detrimental and racist. Assimilation is considered a coercive and racist policy, if not an outright form of cultural erasure and continued genocide. Harrison also presided over the Wounded Knee Massacre, which is considered the largest mass shooting event in U.S. history. Almost 300 Lakota men, women, and children were killed by the U.S. Army. And this is where we bump up against my lack of formal history training. In everything I've read, I can't seem to directly tie Harrison to the massacre. I'm not trying to absolve him. I'm just sharing that I've hit the edge of my ignorance. Without an explicit tie, it's hard for me to weigh how much accountability to assign Harrison for the massacre. The Wounded Knee Massacre is considered the end of the American Frontier Wars, which is a large-scale genocide aimed to terminate an entire continent worth of peoples. Like, for example, in 1800, in what we now call the United States, there were 600,000 indigenous people. 90 years later, that number had dropped to 250,000. That's a shocking crime against humanity. Every single U.S. president, from George Washington through Benjamin Harrison, shoulders blame for these atrocities. And frankly, there hasn't been a president since that has done right by the First Nations. This is where ratings and rankings, they don't make a whole lot of sense to me. How do we weigh the cost of a human life? What about hundreds of thousands of human lives? Does improving the lives of select citizens somehow outweigh atrocities against others? Can life be measured and counted like pebbles on a scale? And if one innocent soul lost is too much to bear, how do we evaluate the men and women whose charge we are in? Like Lincoln said, I'd like to believe we all have our better angels, and that good leadership supports us to act with more virtue. That if taking an innocent life is too much to bear, then taking the life of 350,000 innocent lives is truly unbearable. So in some way, we must account for leadership, analyze it, measure it, debate it, and assert a better way of doing it. In the face of genocide on our own soil from our own leaders, this exercise of ranking the presidents seems frivolous, weirdly detached, and even sociopathic. All I can pray is that including more facts, including more stories, wrestling with this topic pays respect to the ancestors of this land, and in some small way paves the way to care for the urgent needs of our contemporary Native American brothers and sisters. I don't believe we inherit the sins of our fathers, but we are very much responsible for what happens today. If we look around us, what is happening today to First Nations peoples across the United States and the world is inhumane. This is where we are failing our leadership today, right now. These are our fellow citizens, and we have a duty to one another. So before we sit and cast judgment on the past, let's truly take accountability for our actions in the here and now. Negligence may be a strategy, but it's not one that leads to virtue. In the face of chronic genocide, if we can at all claim there's somehow a better or worse, then Benjamin Harrison does not seem to be one of the worst. He is another link in a long chain of violence and domination. Through assimilation, Harrison might have earnestly tried, but as we know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I chose to open the topic of ethnic cleansing here because Benjamin Harrison complicates the picture. Yes, it's both easy and right to condemn Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and score some moral victory points. It's also quite easy and even right to say they all suck, start to finish, and wash our hands of this whole exercise. And honestly, I wouldn't blame you. But it's harder to confront something beyond black and white and to peer into the gray. Benjamin Harrison opens us up to that gray space. He was a racist, and he was a supremacist, and he forcibly stole land. He either passively presided over a massacre or even created the conditions for it. And he also progressed civil rights for Black Americans, opposed anti-immigration bills, and preserved nature. Harrison is like a Ulysses Grant light, but with more authoritative direction setting. And we don't get to a progressive era without Benjamin Harrison, both in terms of policy, but also in the use of executive power to move the country forward. By strengthening the executive branch, he in essence, became a true executive of the nation. He rewrote the social contract between government and citizen. How do we measure a man? This, I do not yet know. But their leadership, here I have some experience. Remember, in my ratings, for better or worse, I chose to weigh each leadership criteria equally. So, for his quiet revolution, of his modernization of the office, for his integrity and pragmatism, I choose to give Benjamin Harrison a score of 3.5. Historians rank him at number 32, which honestly I don't really understand. I'm hard pressed to see how he did something so consequentially worse than the other presidents. If they're all culpable, what makes his culpability any worse than the ones before him? Until I have that answer, I give him a rank of 10, which puts him in the A tier. But we might as well put an asterisk on every one of these leaders, for they were all dabbling in some form of genocide, slavery, supremacy, and racism. It's up to each one of us to assess what's left after that and if that still feels important. Grover Cleveland, Part 2. So following Benjamin Harrison, we go back to Grover Cleveland, who wins his second term. While it's hard to pin down exactly when the progressive era begins, Benjamin Harrison's term and Grover Cleveland's second term set the scene for a change in the political system. They laid the foundation for a new era of politics. And so with that, we transition to a new era, the fourth party system. The Gilded Era changes the US footprint forever. With this enormous boom in industry, we see an entanglement of business, power, and politics. Corruption and unrestrained corporate power dominate. This is where the marriage between Jacksonian spoil system and Whig modernization, corruption and corporatism lead to some pretty bad times. The political fault line and competing visions during this era run between Republicans reforming big business and William Jennings Bryan's Democrats, who call for a return to Jeffersonian agrarianism. The hot-button issues of this era include busting monopolies, labor unions, child labor, corruption, racial segregation, women's suffrage, and immigration. William McKinley. Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland passed the baton to William McKinley, who runs the first leg of the progressive era. McKinley was not a visionary. He was more of the moment than driving the moment. And this is what's interesting about the progressive era. It is not started by a visionary or a strong reactionary. It is the product of pragmatists dealing with real situations at hand. Despite not having a clear vision, McKinley does take another step in modernizing the presidency, particularly in foreign policy. He leads the nation through the Spanish-American War and ushers in an era of expansionism, which more or less becomes the predominant U.S. strategy up and through today. McKinley also strikes a populist tone, rallying people to his cause. Legislatively, he was slow and deliberate, allowing Congress to drive events for him. And in doing so, he did not pass major legislation. He is a man of high integrity and has no corruption. His major knock is that he does not step in to stop violence against Black Americans in the South. All around, McKinley is a serviceable president who left his mark on the office. But his most important decision is one he did not anticipate would radically impact the US, for McKinley is assassinated and his vice president rises to power. For his well-rounded but somewhat unremarkable tenure, William McKinley gets a score of 3.07. Historians have him at 21, and I have him at number 18, which is B tier. Theodore Roosevelt. Up until this moment, every vice president that prematurely takes over the presidency does an absolutely horrible job. But you know what time it is. It's the one, it's the only Theodore Roosevelt. Now, let me give a disclaimer. Teddy is by far my personal favorite president. That doesn't necessarily mean he's the best leader. I just love the guy. TR is a fascinating case study because more than any other president, every political ideology wants to lay claim to his legacy. He's somehow adored by the left and the right, those who seek to wield power and those who want to live and let live. What I love about Teddy is that he is a walking, talking contradiction. He was, at his core, authentically himself. He cared very little about what others thought of him. He followed his impulses, his intuition, and often to great amusement. Look, he was by all standards a total weirdo. Someone might admire his intense passion for hunting wild game. Someone else might equally value that he was sending these specimens back for scientific study. He loved roughing it out in nature, but he was also a prolific author and scholar. In short, Theodore Roosevelt was alive in every essence of the word. He rarely got hung up on ideology or shoulds. The guy just did what he felt was right in the moment. So let's look at this leadership. In Roosevelt, we see the apex of the progressive ideal. While his three predecessors merely adopted the progressive lifestyle, Teddy was born in it, molded by it. He is a true progressive visionary. He full-throatedly believed in nature conservation, trust busting, and building a social democracy. He tried to rein in excess and give the common man a square deal. Theodore was a prize speaker and inspired populist fever with his speeches. And when crisis would hit, whether in the banking sector or the Panama Canal, he would move decisively and with great efficacy. He was renowned for having impeccable character and true respect for the law. Well, let's not forget, he spent his entire career going after corruption and the spoil system. Teddy puts the final nail in the coffin, eliminating the last of Jacksonian corruption at the federal level. After TR, Washington, D.C. employs a civil service that is not at the whims of presidential corruption. In addition to nature conservation and busting monopolies, TR enables fair labor standards, and food safety and labeling are moved into law. And in foreign policy, he was simply a maestro. He was a genius statesman and negotiated peace between major foreign powers. For his diplomatic efforts in avoiding a world war, he rightfully received the Nobel Peace Prize. Mind you, his term only ends 6 years before World War I. Some historians speculate that had TR been president in 1912, he had the respect and authority to potentially avert the Great War. After his presidency, when he traveled to Europe, he was treated like a peer to the monarchs. In terms of advocating for all Americans, the picture does get a bit murkier. In private, TR was certainly racist, but in public, he earnestly advocated and fought for the rights of Black Americans. Despite vitriolic outrage, TR invited Booker T. Washington to have dinner with him at the White House. He also appointed Black Americans to senior positions throughout the federal government. Did he believe in a racial hierarchy? Yes, absolutely. Did he make legitimate strides in advancing Black Americans? Also yes. I leave it up to you to weigh those things. Teddy believed in women's suffrage, and he was a catalyst for Woodrow Wilson's reluctant adoption of women's rights. He falls shortest with Native Americans, who he consistently misunderstood and rarely made efforts to support. If the Gilded Age is the unholy matrimony between industrial modernization and the corrupt spoil system, then it's in Theodore Roosevelt that we see the death blow to unchecked power, greed, corruption, and exploitation. His vision shapes a consistent thread through the rest of US history. For whenever we debate labor rights, worker safety, expanding rights, preserving nature, ending crony capitalism, embracing social democracy, we're speaking of TR's vision. The US had one chance to move to a social democracy similar to Europe, and that movement lived and died with Theodore Roosevelt, champion of the people, equal to none. For his incredible leadership, Theodore Roosevelt gets a score of 4.36. Historians have him at number 4, and I have him at number 3, which places him in S tier. William Taft. Theodore Roosevelt handpicks his successor, William Taft, who is entrusted to carry on with Roosevelt's vision. The only problem? Taft is definitely not Roosevelt. Taft had no vision of his own and was largely negligent and let events guide his hand. He was not able to communicate with the people and is remembered for running a porch campaign, largely refusing to leave his own house. He went against Theodore and actively removed Black Americans from the federal government. He also opposed nature conservation. He had no real legislative accomplishments. While he did continue busting monopolies, he was considerably more business-friendly than Roosevelt. Look, he was a president during a crucial time, from 1908 to 1912. Let's not forget that in 1914, World War I would break out. And what did Taft do with the political capital Roosevelt created in Europe? Absolutely nothing. He used some funds to meddle in Latin America, and he had some vague interest in China, but he did not involve himself in Europe at all. So we go from a president that wins the Nobel Peace Prize for averting a world war to a president that, through his negligence, did not stop one. The only real positive that can be said about William Taft is that he did have a lot of integrity. He eventually becomes a Supreme Court justice, which evidently suited his temperament much more. For his mediocre efforts, William Howard Taft gets a score of 2.07. Historians have him at 24, which honestly I find unreasonably high. I have him at 34, which puts him in the D tier. The election of 1912. Unsurprisingly, Theodore Roosevelt blows a gasket. His hand-picked protege has absolutely shit the bed. So, what does he do? He primaries the son of a bitch. Roosevelt breaks with Washington's honored precedent and runs for an unheard of third term. Spoiler alert, but this sets up a precedent for a certain cousin later down the road. Roosevelt comes out swinging with an intensely progressive agenda. Taft begins to corner machine politicians and pro-business Republicans. It's an all-out brawl for the nomination. Mind you, at this period of time, people didn't actually vote in primaries. There was no direct elections. Instead, the politicians in each state would pick who got the delegates. So Taft starts making inroads on career politicians and cutting backroom deals. And, well, Teddy is Teddy. He demands that states allow direct elections, allowing the people to vote for the party nominee. He creates so much noise that many states actually do switch their system. Today's primary elections are thanks to TR. And a pattern emerges. States that allow people to vote for Teddy. States that rely on backroom political deals go for Taft. And in the end, Taft manages to secure more delegates and become the nominee for president under the Republican Party. Unfazed, Roosevelt decides to form a new political party and run against Taft and the Democratic nominee, Woodrow Wilson. So we've got a legit three-way race, including a former president. This shit here is important. Taft is soaking up all the pro-business votes. Teddy, a super popular former president, is putting all his chips on turning the US into a social democracy. So what does the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson do? If we omit Grover Cleveland, the last time a Democrat was elected president was James Buchanan before the Civil War. Woodrow decides to run on a progressive campaign. He figures if Taft takes pro-business voters and Roosevelt goes too much towards socialism, he could somewhat split the difference. Progressive policies were so damn popular that even the Democrats needed to run on progressivism to have a chance at power. That is how powerful Roosevelt's vision framed US politics at the time. And this was a crazy campaign. Famously, Roosevelt gets shot by an assassin and then goes on to immediately give a campaign speech with a bullet lodged in his chest. But more importantly, the election of 1912 is where we see the beginnings of the parties switching positions, with Republicans moving toward Taft's conservative progressivism and the Democrats moving towards Wilson's flavor of Southern progressivism. We start the long march to our modern political map. Ultimately, Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican vote, allowing Wilson to win the presidency. Coming in an impressive second place, Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party are defeated, and we see the death of social democracy in the US. And Woodrow Wilson only wins 42% of the national vote, which is the lowest since 1860. But it's enough to win. And a win's a win. So we must live with another great what if. What if Roosevelt won a third term? But instead of that, we're going to turn our focus to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is another one of our devils. That makes 3 so far, and each is pretty consequential in transitioning the nation to a different form of governance. Whereas Theodore Roosevelt came to define the era and create the political system by which all politicians define themselves, Wilson had a vision that fit within that progressive box. That is the difference between a visionary and a vision. Woodrow Wilson comes into office with a vision to expand US power. He has this messianic complex, and he wants to spread his version of democracy and freedom around the world. He considers himself an extraordinary orator, and according to him, to the orator go the spoils. That those who have power to move men have a duty to wield force. Now, I don't think he was as influential and inspiring as he made himself out to be. And on the positive side, Wilson does continue the progressive streak of his predecessors by passing laws that favored labor rights, child labor laws, unions, and trust busting through the Federal Trade Commission. He also instituted the federal income tax and Federal Reserve System. And this is the moment I will be blamed for becoming quote-unquote political. Presidential decisions starting with Wilson start to melt into contemporary political debates. Libertarians who disproportionately become historians and YouTube watchers may disproportionately watch this video and consider these two acts, a central bank and federal income tax, to be 2 large sins. So let me make 2 points. The first, please return to my behavioral anchors on domestic policy. Remember, good leadership in this category means recreating the systems and structures of the nation. So even without placing a value judgment on the Fed and the income tax, these constitute a form of positive leadership. But second, fuck it, I will now also make a value judgment, as both of these policies are pro-social and good for the country. Without any federal income tax, no federal social programs can exist. Roads, bridges, tunnels, dams, having a military, border control, veteran care, not to mention social programs like Social Security and healthcare. In 2025, a lot of these are not controversial projects for a government to take on. One of the enduring hangups in the US is that government is this big bad daddy out to abuse us. We have this collective projection of government as automatic authoritarianism. But that's not the only way to conceptualize government. It's just the matrix we've built for ourselves and live inside with dread and terror. Government is how society, our collective efforts, express themselves. So as much as we Americans want to pretend we're rugged individuals and completely isolated, independent of one another, on this hero's journey, the truth is that we are always interdependent. We all rely on each other's efforts. Coordinating those efforts to do large-scale projects is the role of government. Some things are just too big to organize privately. Even the darlings of libertarianism, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, they admit in their writings something similar. A wealthy government can and should improve the lives of its people. Honestly, I find it really odd we spend so much time tiptoeing around libertarianism, which is like purely conceptual and never exists in practice. Economies cannot exist in a vacuum. Economies can only exist within a political framework. Unless you believe in complete and total anarchy, then some government is needed. Rules and arbiters are needed. This is like basic econ 101. Government enables us to increase the efficiency of the market by keeping the game fair. So what if tax is not theft, but a contribution to our fellow citizens, to the great project that is our nation? If you don't like what the government does with your money, that is super fair, and I don't either. But that's a very different debate than not contributing nothing to society. I once had a friend who was Republican, and he got fired from his job, and he was debating whether he should take unemployment benefits. And I told him, dude, that's why I'm paying taxes, so you don't become homeless. Please take the unemployment benefits. He did, and it helped him get back on his feet. Wilson's income tax is progress, and if you think that makes me biased, so be it. But then please do me a favor. For even just 1 week, don't use anything that's ever been created, built, subsidized, or invented through the use of government funds. If you can do that, then I'm all ears to hear about your experience. Until then, you're just bullshitting us. The same goes for establishing the Federal Reserve, a centralized bank that controls the flow of money. The Fed is by no means perfect. They are often way off in their timing, and managing the money supply is not a science. They get it wrong, both by understimulating and overstimulating the economy. But almost all economists, and I was trained as one, surprise, believe that the Fed is a net positive. I'm not going to fully open this topic in this video, but most people have no freaking clue how international finance works. And I'm going to be blunt, without the Fed, we would be super fucked in international finance, which could bring the whole nation down. If you want to know how the world really works, follow the money. Money is what really runs the world, and we need the Fed to help us do that. In these actions, Wilson did increase the size of the government, but that was inevitable. As complexity in society and economy grows, the size of the government must increase to ensure we have the capacity to regulate it. More players requires more referees. With the Industrial Revolution exponentially changing society, with cities booming, with multinationals exploding in growth, there is no choice. The other backdrop for the Wilson administration is World War I. And on a positive side, he got the nation through the war and we were on the winning side, which is huge. But this largely brings us to the end of the positives. And even those, I had to spend time justifying and arguing why they could even be considered positives. So from here, we get into the bad and the ugly. And oh boy, there's going to be a lot of bad and ugly. Woodrow Wilson was a virulent racist, like really racist. He mainlined the lost cause myth into the veins of America. Like, take this in. He would only denounce slavery on economic grounds, never moral or humanitarian reasons. He openly praised terrorist groups like the KKK. Famously, he screened a KKK propaganda film at the White House, The Birth of a Nation. That's pretty much well known, but what's not talked about as much is that before Wilson, the KKK was almost completely dead. It was his screening that revived the KKK. Like, people saw him getting hyped and said, let's reboot this terrorist organization. He actively went out of his way to segregate the federal government. Like, we already had integration, and he was like, nah, I'm bringing Jim Crow right into the White House. There's this wave of terrorism and lynchings in the South, and he did absolutely nothing about it. On the other hand, he's very excited to pass both the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. The Espionage Act mandated arrests for anyone who said anything bad about the war effort. The Sedition Act wanted to make the Espionage Act even more brutal by prosecuting anyone who was in any way disloyal to the US government, the flag, almost anything they wanted. And he wanted to pass these before the US even got into World War I. At this juncture, you might be wondering, well, why do I support the income tax and the Federal Reserve, but not the Espionage and Sedition Acts? Aren't they both big government overreach? Leadership is about being responsive. It's about meeting the moment, meeting the situation. It's about striking an equilibrium that works for this point in time. We never step in the same river twice. So the question is, does this presidential action improve the lives of the many diverse constituents in this country? In the case of raising money to fund collective projects like roads, these are pro-social and beneficial projects. And as our republic more and more took the shape of a democracy, following the will of the people in enacting collective projects is a good thing. The progressive movement arose as a response to the environment. It did not come out of a book or a philosophy or a dogma. Largely, these were leaders trying to solve real problems, not trying to arbitrarily force a concept to work. This should work. That's a theory. That's mind control. The Espionage and Sedition Acts are egregious because they're not solving a problem. They're not responses, they're reactions. Reactions based entirely on fear and control. And that's when leadership actually disappears. And instead, we get dominance and force. Woodrow Wilson's use of fear, control, dominance, and force extend outside of our borders. While past administrations dabbled in small foreign affairs here and there, it's only under Wilson that we have full-scale intervention. Wilson's father was a preacher. As a result, he thought the US was like a New Jerusalem that had a duty to push its values internationally. He famously said that nations had a right to self-determination, but what he meant is that white people had a right to self-determination. He full-on invaded Mexico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. It was the first time the US changed a political regime through direct military force. He also empowered 2 spy agencies to spy on US domestic citizens. Wilson was crazy power hungry and relished in flexing his muscle, often against his own citizens, our neighbors, and countries around the world. In Wilson, we see this white Christian imperialistic fever dream take flight. So yeah, the guy had a vision, one I largely disagree with, but it still counts as a vision. A couple more confusing points for consideration. Wilson was against women's suffrage for most of his administration. Teddy! But he actually reversed course and supported the 19th Amendment, albeit more out of pragmatic political calculus. But the fact remains, he put pressure on the Senate to make it happen. So we have this egomaniac white supremacist to thank for women obtaining the vote. Like a project like this, again, ranking all these men, particularly when they rigged the game to exclude the voices of women, has inevitably and unfortunately meant we've almost exclusively focused on, well, men. In that sense, a project like this tends to reaffirm 2 biases for a lot of people. The first bias is that history is only about great men, that we should only study people in positions of authority, because that's what we're doing, right? Franklin Pierce was in a position of authority, but he wasn't like a good leader. And history is not just about authority. The past is filled with millions of people like you and me, ordinary people who make up the nation, all performing trillions and trillions of acts of leadership that never make it into a history book. And then there's another bias. Bias number 2 is that because we're studying these men, it means that women didn't show leadership. And this is one of the crazier positions to take. There's many contributions of women at all levels of society, and unfortunately that's out of the scope of this video. But it's a huge stain on Western society that for so long we shut out 50% of our population. I can think of no greater waste for society than allowing half of our people not to be able to contribute their gift to the collective. Ironically, maybe Wilson is the perfect president to make this case. In 1919, he had a serious stroke that he never recovered from, and many historians argue that his wife, Edith Wilson, ran the White House for the last 18 months of his presidency. So maybe it's Edith we should be ranking. The other controversial Wilsonian dream was an international body called the League of Nations, a failed predecessor of the United Nations. Wilson called for international cooperation and was one of the chief architects of the League. For his role, he even got the Nobel Peace Prize. But the US never ended up joining the League and it failed. But we will say an important seed was planted. All right, Woodrow, you've taken up enough space. You did some good things and some god-awful things. You are a true American devil. For that reason, Woodrow Wilson gets a score of 2.83. Historians have him at 13, which is quite high, I think. I have him at 23. You are in C tier, Woody. Warren G. Harding. All right, y'all, you are sleeping on Warren G. Harding. I'm telling you right now, historians are wrong about Warren G. First of all, the next 3 presidents, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, they're kind of taught as this monolithic libertarian nirvana, which is just not true. We're only 8 years removed from Theodore Roosevelt freaking out and ripping the Republican Party in 2. But Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover are still Republicans in the progressive era. Yes, some of them are closer to business-friendly Taft than to Roosevelt, but don't sleep on them. Give Warren G a chance. Warren Harding had a very clear sense of direction for the US. He was by no means a visionary, but he was proactive domestically and in foreign affairs. He was a decent speaker, plain-spoken, direct, and he told the truth as he saw it. He really advocated for minority rights. He went as far as physically going down to the South and publicly calling for an end to prejudice and equal application of the law. In Birmingham, he told a segregated audience that due to Jim Crow, democracy is a lie. Bro, I think if a politician did this today, they would get murdered for doing this. Imagine doing it in 1918. Harding inherited a depressed post-war economy and managed to stimulate it. He moved to action and continuously adapted. But what's also interesting is that he largely stayed out of things and significantly reduced the role of government. And he was overarchingly seen as pro-business. To me, this is incredibly impressive. He supported business, civil rights, reduced government, and took action and adapted to stimulate the economy. This is great leadership because it doesn't follow a script. He's not operating out of a dogma. Harding is somehow improving things across the board in a way we might find ideologically difficult to pinpoint. Okay, but it doesn't end there. Harding may have also been one of the most technology-forward presidents ever. He worked hard to spread electricity, regulate radio broadcasts, and introduce new infrastructure spending. And shockingly, he managed to balance the budget. His administration spurred economic growth, leading to the Roaring Twenties. He very much tried to pass anti-lynching legislation, but failed to convince Congress. In foreign affairs, he took a hard pivot from the religious zealotry of Wilson. He was suspicious of the League of Nations and kept the US out. But he negotiated peace with Europe and negotiated disarmament. He really promoted peace. So across the board, Harding tackled hard and complicated problems, and more or less did so successfully, in an almost ideologically paradoxical fashion. Oh, and he did this in 2 years. He unfortunately has a heart attack and dies. At the time of his death, he was one of the most popular presidents of all time. Yet historians have him ranked at 38 out of 40. So here's the main point of contention. Was Harding corrupt? After his death, a lot of dirt was aired about him, which completely tarnished his reputation. I'll start with the personal side of things. Harding had romantic affairs. He cheated on his wife. But as it pertains to his leadership, I could truly care less about what he does in his bedroom. There's a weird morality applied to Harding when it comes to him cheating. Like, many presidents cheated? Fuck, I mean, Thomas Jefferson psychosexually abused his slave, fathered children with her, then ensured his own children remained enslaved. Oh yeah, and Sally Hemings was his wife's biological half-sister. So yeah, his wife's father also fathered Sally. Thomas was all about that freaky shit. Where's that same energy for Harding when it comes to Jefferson, Grover Cleveland, or JFK? For the time being, let's remove sex, which I think has no basis on presidential leadership. Let's talk about the scandals. Harding had, to put it mildly, a very mixed track record of picking good cabinet members. Some did a very good job, some were a bit incompetent, and a few were outright corrupt. But when I looked into each and every scandal, I found a similar pattern. When Harding found out, he immediately removed them from their positions. He himself was not corrupt, nor did he condone corruption. For the largest scandal, the Teapot Dome scandal, Harding didn't even know it was happening during his life. In my opinion, the greatest sin Harding committed was not being a judge of good character. He picked some good, some average, some bad. But upon finding out the bad, he took action. He removed them from their positions. Is that worth rating him worse than Franklin Pierce, who actively tore the nation in two? Like, historians have totally lost the plot. Justice for Warren. Warren Harding is begging us to look at the role of historians and how much they're influenced by sentiment. Like, is it all about vibes? Because I can't fathom how in 2 years of constructive action, Harding is sandwiched between Franklin Pierce, Andrew Johnson, and James Buchanan. These are the architects of a fucking civil war. And Harding, because he picked 3 bad cabinet members, should be in the middle of them? Please make it make sense. Historians elevate and mute facts to tell a story that aligns with their current values, but letting vibes dictate rankings seems crazy to me. Harding is a wonderful case study in leadership. He acted proactively and got things done. He made social progress. He spoke up for disenfranchised groups and said the truth, even when it physically put him in danger in the South. And he did it while reducing the size and reach of the government. Look, if you're looking for an ideology hidden in this video, I'm afraid you're going to struggle to find one. Good leadership can use power, but it also knows when to let go. It can benefit the people, and it also benefits business. But the key is that it responds in the moment to what is needed. It doesn't get stuck in a little mind castle, always trying to impose a view of how things should be. It doesn't converge on fear, force, control. Leadership is dynamic and flexible, principled and virtuous. And I see that in Warren G. Harding. For his very good leadership, I give Harding a score of 3.29. Historians might have him at 38, but I have him at number 13, which is close to the top of B tier. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge is a bit of an odd fellow and certainly didn't go to DC to make friends. After Harding's death, he is yet another vice president promoted into the big seat. And as is usually the case after a vice president prematurely becomes president, Coolidge has no real vision for the nation and largely wanted to maintain the status quo. He's also not known for being a good communicator. He earned the nickname Silent Cow. He was completely uninterested and uninvolved in foreign policy, which is a bit striking given the US had just exited a world war and Europe was in shambles. He quite dogmatically and routinely refused to respond to crisis. The Great Mississippi Flood was the equivalent of his Katrina, and he just didn't do anything. And here's once again where I'm going to annoy the libertarians. If someone trips and falls in front of me, I'm going to offer to help them up. I'll see if they're okay. Ignoring suffering when we can help doesn't make you cool. You're just unnecessarily an asshole, cut off from healthy emotion. And again, the funny thing, within this highly fantasized concept of government, when the referees don't call a foul, they're still picking a side. Case in point, Coolidge's biases towards big business end up shafting farmers. My point is not that being hands-off is bad, it's just that we have to respond to the moment. If we can support our fellow neighbors in a time of crisis, we should. If we're asked to set the rules, then let's actually call a fair game. But this is still the progressive era, isn't it? And Coolidge is a Republican. Coolidge, to his credit, is a very strong advocate for minority rights. He once again tried to pass the federal anti-lynching bill, but failed. He was outspoken for black rights and women's suffrage, and he also passed a bill to grant Native American citizenship, for the first time allowing our indigenous people equal rights. On paper, at least. It was also during Coolidge's administration that the corruption of the Harding administration came to light. Coolidge had exceptional integrity and helped put the White House back on track. All in all, some good, some mediocre, and some bad, but not that much stands out. For his mixed performance, Calvin Coolidge gets a score of 2.43. Historians have him at 30, and I have him at 28, which is D tier. Herbert Hoover. I have a sense that historians or the media are trying to rehabilitate the image of Herbert Hoover. Hoover was a career politician and government bureaucrat. When he came into office, he had absolutely no vision for the nation and was completely reactive. Well, honestly, even that might be putting it too favorably. He hated speaking and was an abhorrent communicator. He allowed the media to completely frame his presidency and could not cut through the noise. Despite the rise of fascism in Europe, Hoover was completely uninterested in world affairs. And then there's the completely forgotten ethnic cleansing. Under Hoover, 1 million Mexican Americans were deported, 60% of which were U.S. citizens. So the dude just casually commits one of the worst atrocities against his own citizens, and we just never talk about it. He also didn't care at all about Black Americans or women at a really crucial moment in their respective fight for rights and safety. And then, of course, we have the Great Depression. The economy tanked, and Hoover spent 3 years doing nothing about it. He was a dogmatic ideologue, and candidly, he earned the scorn that goes his way. Recently, historians seem to be trying to rehab his image and point out that he eventually did act in the Great Depression. So we can give him, I guess, some small credit because he did some experiments, but those came 3 years after a lot of suffering, and they also came conveniently around election time. My interpretation, the guy was trying to juke the stats to win another term. The only positive thing I could say about Hoover is that he was a philanthropist and he did encourage charity. So he coined volunteerism and he had no corruption in his administration. But he really benefited no one. He was too stuck in his own head and sat by while people suffered across the board. Libertarians might cheerlead this display of disassociated dogma, but that's not leadership. It's a wonder there was no revolution or government overthrow given the severity of the need and the complete lack of action. For his total negligence, Hoover gets a score of 1.71. Historians have him at 34, and I have him at number 37, which is undoubtedly F tier. And so with the economy collapsing, so ends the progressive era, which took on crony capitalism and tried to give the people a fair shake. The fifth party system. Amidst the Great Depression, a political earthquake takes place. Franklin Delano Roosevelt realigns voters and creates a vision that dominates the next 40 years. The New Deal coalition rapidly expands social welfare programs and unites the underprivileged, working class, and minority groups, including unions, Catholics, Jews, and Black Americans. It's amongst this diversity that equality before the law and civil rights becomes a central issue. And here we also see the emergence of the American empire in international affairs. Between the US dollar as reserve currency, NATO, and a litany of international political bodies, the United States emerges as a superpower. More than any other period, FDR's political system creates the world we now live in. Franklin Roosevelt. Let me get my bias out of the way. I really don't like FDR. I can't put my finger on it, but there's something about him that skeeves me out. But we're not here to talk about my personal feelings. Let's take a look at his leadership. FDR would end up in power for 12 years during one of the most consequential times in US history. There's a lot that we could cover here, but I'm going to try to do my best to keep it short. I hope that it comes as no surprise that FDR was a visionary and completely altered the social contract in the US. He comes in with a bold, strong vision that alters how the country and political landscape will look like for decades to follow. If the progressives were about creating fair rules and calling a fair game, then the New Deal pushed that aside so government could take care of the people directly. FDR also had a strong vision for America as the leader of the global community. He was a phenomenal communicator. His fireside chats during the Great Depression, they moved people, and he kept the nation inspired and motivated during World War II. When it comes to crisis management, he was decisive, energetic, comprehensive, and adaptable time and time again. He led from the front and did so with skill. The New Deal was truly transformative, and it was a massive leap in moving the US out of survival mode. He permanently fixed runs on banks, introduced many important regulatory bodies to rein in corporate lunacy. He put people back to work, stimulated the economy, created some social safety net with the Social Security Act. This was truly the most impressive retooling of the American economic landscape in our history, and we still cherish many of the New Deal programs to this day, almost 100 years later. FDR successfully navigated and was a prominent leader of the alliance during World War II. In essence, he creates the framework for the post-war global infrastructure, including the United Nations, and he had the vision for the American empire as we know it, putting the US in the seat of power across all global institutions. He had high levels of personal integrity and no corruption in his administration. But, and I think this is what bothers me, is he was extremely political and partisan. A lot of New Deal programs were leveraged to win elections. He kind of started the whole pay constituencies to vote for you thing. If you were a safe vote or a completely unattainable vote, you probably didn't get as much help from Franklin. In this, I feel like he was a little bit of a hack. Sure, he helped out Black and Native Americans with money, but he did not really support them in actions, words, or deeds. He continued Hoover's ethnic cleansing of Mexican Americans. He imprisoned Japanese Americans, including second and third generation Americans. He also imprisoned German and Italian Americans. And he refused to allow Jewish refugees to come during the Holocaust. But he did strive for the general welfare of the nation and was a massive conservationist on par with Cousin Teddy. Did FDR lead the nation through a horrific depression and existential world war? Yes. Was he kind of a partisan hack and loved special interests? Seems so. Did he commit atrocities against American citizens of Mexican, Japanese, German, and Italian heritage? Big time. So when we weigh all of this together, overall, he is a great leader, but I don't like him. Franklin Roosevelt gets a score of 4.5. Historians rank him at number 1 of all time, and for better or for worse, I have him at number 2, which is S tier. Harry Truman. After the unexpected death of FDR, Truman is yet another vice president to step up before his time. If FDR had the vision, it was Truman that saw it through. The real Truman Show is the one we're all living in now. Truman was by no means visionary, but he came in with a very strong point of view on domestic policy. He was an ardent New Deal advocate during his time in the Senate, and he wanted to finish the job. He does approach the level of visionary in foreign policy. He had a clear and original point of view on the role and direction the US should play in the New World Order. I wouldn't say that Truman was the greatest speaker per se. He spoke in plain English and didn't really enthuse the media, but people responded to him, and he had a skill in communicating directly to ordinary citizens in the US. Truman possibly has the highest level of integrity of any president while serving in office. And we would honestly be blessed to have a president as humble and as selfless as Harry S. Truman in our lifetimes. In everything I've read and studied, Truman had only one question: what would be good for the country as a whole? He's the rare case of a person leaving the White House having made no money and even falling on financial hardship. Truman truly and genuinely pushed for civil rights. One of the first presidents since Grant to offer sweeping legislation. When he didn't pass, he issued executive orders to desegregate the military and government right before his election, even though it was akin to political suicide. He pushed back on McCarthyism and the Red Scare, desperate to end the paranoia. He fell short in domestic policy, where he was not able to get much through the Congress. He pushed for broad progressive plans, but could not get them through. During crisis, he moved with decisive speed and courage. Truman took action, adapting, without ideology to support the country and ordinary people. But it is Truman's foreign policy that has set the stage for the last 80 years and truly gave birth to the US empire. Truman revitalized Europe after the war. The Berlin airlift, the Marshall Plan, the formation of NATO, United Nations, US dollar as reserve currency. Truman creates containment with the Soviets, which historians believe was a net positive. He finished the war in Japan, where there still is a massive controversy about the use of atomic bombs, which ranges from being an absolute necessity to win the war to being a war crime. He also bought into the domino theory of communism and got the US into the Korean War. To be honest, I have no idea if Japan and Korea were morally good or bad decisions, and I'm not going to weigh in on them in this video, but he did lead us through 2 wars. Truman created the global security apparatus that still exists, and he placed the US first among firsts, creating US hegemony and with a large dose actually of humanity and optimism. He did so in a responsible, even-handed way. He earnestly and urgently tried to do right by people. He thought globally and acted out of principle, always taking responsibility and accountability. I know that many partisans will ardently disagree with me, but the US has often had an intensely positive impact on the world. We're way far from perfect and often create much darkness. But as far as empires go, we did not create the global chaos perpetrated by the British, and we don't act as transactionally as the Chinese. The US often complicates its own foreign relations and projects because it at least tries imperfectly to make the world a better place. There would be no European Union without the US. Wherever we see some humanitarianism in US policy, I think we have Truman to thank. Much of what we define as American exceptionalism is Truman in action, and for good reason. Harry Truman is an exemplary leader who left the nation in a much better state than when he found it. And here's the point I want to make about Truman. It would be easy to say Truman acted in nefarious ways, or Truman acted just out of a sense of preservation or safety or security. But when you really read about Truman, none of these are the actual motivation and intention behind his actions in foreign policy. Truman ardently believed in peace. He himself served in World War I, and he presided over the end of World War II. He desperately wanted a lasting peace, and he really, truly, empathetically cared about people. He might be one of our most empathetic leaders, up there with Lincoln. For Truman, really supporting people was at the top of his agenda. So when he enacts the Berlin airlift, when he enacts the Marshall Plan, he does so because he wants to help people. It's not a cynical gambit for more power. And so as we're going to see, of course, he creates this machinery, this system, this apparatus that then gets hijacked by fellow presidents and gets turned quite ugly. And maybe that's the biggest pitfall of Truman, is that we didn't end up having more Trumans. He didn't set up checks and balances. For that apparatus under someone with the integrity of a Truman can help the world. It can help the United States. That same apparatus without checks and balances under a different leader that has more fear, more control, more greed, more forcefulness can turn ugly quickly. And so in many ways, I personally applaud Truman for trying. I think he made a big step and role modeled something that's quite rare in history. Unfortunately, we didn't have many more presidents like him. By concentrating the levers of power, Truman in essence gives later presidents the blank check to run the world in increasingly poor ways. And in that, I do think there's some responsibility and some accountability. But for the man himself, for the leader himself, I applaud him for trying to make the world a better place. For his tremendous integrity and empathy, he gets a score of 3.96. Historians have him at number 7, and I have him at number 5, which is S tier. Dwight D. Eisenhower. There's something I can't quite pin down about Dwight Eisenhower. He was and is still very popular, but he also set in motion many crises that would drag down the US in the coming decades. For one, he did not have a strong vision, and without a sense of direction, he relied on just some guiding principles, but could also be at times quite reactionary. He was okay in uniting the country. Again, there wasn't a lot of proactivity here, and like Truman, he did push back on the more extreme parts of McCarthyism. He was overall quite passive on the domestic agenda. The economic abundance of the 1950s was in large part due to the GI Bill, which was passed 10 years earlier by FDR. So Eisenhower, in large parts, is kind of coasting on the success of the New Deal. He rightfully does get praise for the US highway system, which was sold in the interest of national security, but the shadow side of this is the explosion in automobile usage. So when we say the US was designed for the car, In some way, we must thank Ike's highways. In an alternative universe, maybe we could have instead built trains and other public transportation systems. The highway system was also used to physically enact racist structures, deeply etching division into the American landscape. Between redlining and displacement, the legacy of the highway system is not as bright as it used to be. And before Ike chastised the military-industrial complex, he first created it. We kind of just assume that the military-industrial complex just morphed magically out of thin air, but Truman, to his credit, tried and succeeded in largely dismantling large parts of the World War II apparatus. So it's Eisenhower, a former military general, who creates this cozy relationship between military and government, and then turns right around and warns us about the monster that he helped create. Eisenhower also had horrible foreign policy record. While he solidified NATO in Europe, he let the CIA and State Department just run amok. Some of the shadiest shit the US, and specifically the CIA, did was under Eisenhower. US presidents intervened more and more since the Spanish-American War, and Woodrow Wilson did straight up invade sovereign nations to enact regime change. But Eisenhower makes all of this look like child's play. In Eisenhower, we see the philosophy of regime change, covert operations, taking down whole governments, fully actualized. Many of these interventions not only didn't help us, but they ended up hurting us. They were mostly driven by control, fear, paranoia, destabilizing South America, destabilizing Southeast Asia, Africa, Cuba, destabilizing the Middle East. Virtually every conflict the US has found itself in the last 75 years finds its roots in the Eisenhower administration. So if Truman gives us this hope for a new humanitarian world order, Eisenhower infects it with greed, control, and fear. And the trouble with history is that this cause and effect cycle takes a long time to realize. So we might not know these secretive coups that destabilize the entire world until 70 years have gone by. We might not see how Cold War paranoia drives the government to lie and poisons the trust we have in our institutions until 70 years have gone by. On the flip side, Eisenhower did successfully respond to crises in the moment. He was not very ideological, and he could respond when it was needed. He had great personal integrity, unimpeachable character, and no corruption. He was a gifted speaker and really connected with the American people and the press. In many ways, it's very easy to see why, in the moment, in the 1950s, we would consider Eisenhower a great leader. But here's one of the keys I leave you with. Leadership is about impact. As cliche as it may sound, there are two different paths we can take in any creation: the path of love and the path of fear. When Eisenhower created out of fear, he sowed the dark seeds that would eventually lead to the collapse of US power. Of course, later presidents were also responsible for tasting this fruit, but the roots start with Ike. It's impossible to know all the unintended consequences of our actions. There are always positive and negative byproducts in any action, but the way to minimize those negative byproducts is to not make choices based on short-term fear. Does this necessarily make Eisenhower a bad leader? No, I think he was a good leader for his time, but his lack of awareness ultimately cost us big time. For his mixed record, Dwight D. Eisenhower gets a score of 3.36. Historians rank him at number 6, but I have him at number 12. And I do wonder if his foreign policy will receive more scrutiny in the future. This places him in the B tier. John F. Kennedy. Here's a hot take right out of the gate. I don't think JFK was a good president, and I don't think he was a good leader. He ran on vibes, and his legacy is largely colored by his assassination. So enough time has gone by, let's get real here. JFK had a vision to expand and extend the New Deal, but he was by no means visionary. He essentially just wanted to do more of what FDR was already pushing out. Possibly due to his inexperience, possibly his skills, he was really not good in a crisis. He often was indecisive and unable to adapt in the moment. And then there's this whole scholarly debate. How much of JFK's New Frontier agenda was actually passed in Congress? While he was alive, it seems about 50% of his bills were passed. But were they his biggest priorities? Arguably not. And most big stuff was passed under Lyndon Johnson after the assassination. And even during JFK's administration, it was LBJ who shoved things through Congress. We're now in the realm of speculation, but if he had not been assassinated, I actually think the New Frontier agenda would have largely stalled out and sputtered out. He was also kind of a shady dude. So even when we put the affairs aside, he appointed family members to government posts. He would publicly praise Martin Luther King Jr. and then direct the FBI to wiretap him. He kept many secrets. All in all, there's no overt corruption, but something doesn't sit right with me in the integrity department. And I characterize his foreign policy as disastrous. He let the CIA run even more rampant than the Eisenhower years. He set the stage for the Vietnam War and botched the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. He gets credit for the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I think this only looks good because we now know the outcome. He gambled super hard super high risk, medium reward scenario. And I just don't know if that brinkmanship is good policy. There are two places where JFK really shines, and those are worth the hype and the acclaim. He made genuine efforts to promote civil rights for both Black Americans and for women, and while he couldn't get anything passed, I do believe he made a significant impact in changing hearts and minds, particularly because he was a truly iconic orator, one of the best in our nation's history. His voice and speeches moved the nation. He inspired us, brought us together, and moved us forward. In JFK, we can see the true power of great communications and the tremendous impact it can have on leadership. Amazing communications, youth and vitality, caring for the nation. This is what I boil down to good vibes, then immortalized by martyrdom. But I don't think that's enough to outweigh the actual governance. John F. Kennedy gets a score of 3.11. Historians have him at number 9, and I have him at number 16, which is B tier. Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson ascends from vice president after JFK's assassination, but he's no wallflower. LBJ comes in with a strong vision of his own. Unlike Kennedy, he does not just want to extend the New Deal. LBJ wants to leave a large imprint on American society. In Johnson, we see the civil rights movement finally pass its major legislation, finally enforcing the laws passed after the Civil War. Jim Crow is largely ended, and immigrants of all types of backgrounds receive positive rights. All of this coming from a man from Texas. Johnson also pushes through Medicare, Medicaid, and expands Social Security. He severely expands funding for education and tries to reduce the wealth gap. These programs are still the cornerstone of the American social safety net. Overall, LBJ seems trustworthy and did not have major corruption, but his personality was strong, to put it mildly, and I feel like that has colored a lot of his legacy. In terms of crisis management, he has a mixed record. So he's able to respond to some issues, but then completely botches other ones like the war in Vietnam. Look, there were many social and cultural forces that stood in his way, and I think ultimately he succumbed to them. He tried to shape the times, but the times inevitably wore him down. The old social order was shaking at its core. Institutions were challenged, and the US found itself in a foreign policy quagmire. Ultimately, LBJ lost control of the game, and the nation felt like it was drifting. This feeling at the end of his term mostly clouds his other achievements. For his mixed record, Lyndon Johnson gets a 3.58. Historians rank him at number 8, and I have him at number 9. Which is A tier. Richard Nixon. There are 4 devils in American politics: Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Woodrow Wilson, and finally, Richard Tricky Dick Nixon. Nixon was an opportunist through and through. He did not have a vision, and I don't even know if I could say he had guiding principles. He took the experiment of being a politician to the extreme, and so we get many contradictions and paradoxes. There's been this recent push to rehabilitate Nixon's image, which again, I find a bit weird. He was a prolific and proficient foreign statesman. He opened up China and in many ways created a productive relationship with the USSR. He wound down the war in Vietnam, and I think it's fair to acknowledge he was super impressive in his diplomatic relations. But from there, things get weird and then they get ugly. Weird in that he was super racist and an all-around asshole, but then he went and supported women and the Equal Rights Amendment. He also supported Native Americans. He signed the most progressive environmental policies, but then remodeled the US electorate to supercharge a very racist bloc in the South. In some ways, he was pushing unity, in other ways, he was completely undermining it. In crisis, he was adaptable, but also opportunistic, and he was an unhinged paranoid, a depressive, and an alcoholic while in office. He could not manage his emotions at all. This extreme paranoia and fear consistently makes Tricky Dick self-sabotage and undermine his own leadership. Aside from spying on his opposition in an election that he was all but sure to win, he also started a Republican trend of committing treason to win elections. He back-channeled with a foreign power, in this case Vietnam, to alter the election results. Collusion and conspiracy with a foreign government to seize power is one of the lowest things a president can do. And herein lies the trouble with politicians. When they lack vision, when they lack virtues, they do what is expedient or popular. They infect the nation with their greed and fear. They act selfishly. These politicians poison the soul of the nation. Nixon makes some real progressive achievement and then throws them all away and destroys trust in the government. For his paradoxical performance, he gets a score of 2.64. Historians rank him at 26, and I have him at 25. Which places him in the D tier. Gerald Ford. Oh, Gerald Ford. we have yet again a vice president who takes over early after Nixon resigns due to corruption. Jerry epitomizes the ineptitude of a vice president who has absolutely no vision and forms a caretaker government. Look, I hope it's pretty obvious that campaigning to be a president, what I'll call politics, is quite a different skill set than actually being a president, which I'll call governing. The 2 years leading up to election are super different than the 4 to 8 years actually running the nation, which is why I'm focusing on leadership and governance and not popularity or political skills. But running for office prepares candidates to govern, particularly when it comes to creating a vision. It's really hard to create a compelling vision and then articulate it in an inspiring way to the people. It takes time, practice, repetition. When vice presidents take over, they have no time to form their own vision. 15 vice presidents have gone on to become president. Of those 15, 10 became president without an election. On average, these unelected presidents have a 2.3 in vision. Vice presidents that are elected president in their own right have a vision of 3.2. Another way to look at it, of the vice presidents that prematurely became president, 7 of them get either 1s or 2s for vision and are super forgettable. Only Teddy Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Lyndon Johnson seized the helm and made something of the office. What's also interesting, of the 15 VPs that became president, only 6, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, are re-elected, and Nixon ended up resigning in disgrace. 9 vice presidents become president: John Adams, Martin Van Buren, John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, Chester A. Arthur, Gerald Ford, George H.W. Bush, and Joe Biden failed to secure a second term. This begs the question, is the vice president position at all valuable? Sure, there is immediate continuity and someone's at the helm, but largely these are ineffective, weak leaders who at best maintain a very fragile status quo. The vice presidents that are effective, in particular Teddy Roosevelt and Harry Truman, were more than anything happy accidents. Only Lyndon Johnson makes some logical sense, as he was a seasoned Senate leader and even ran against JFK in the Democratic primaries. I honestly wonder if it would be better off having the VP run a caretaker government while we hold snap elections, as parliamentary systems do in Europe. The cost of these mediocre leaders is just way too high in my book. Case in point, Gerald Ford did not accomplish anything during his term. There's absolutely nothing worth mentioning across crisis management, domestic policy, foreign policy, vision, or communication. The only thing he's remembered for is having a personal sense of integrity, although even that was diluted by his pardon of Nixon. So at best we can say he kept the lights on. A lot was going on in the 70s, and we were just completely rudderless for years. Surely that can't be optimal, right? For his absolute mediocrity, Gerald Ford gets a score of 2.39. Historians have him at number 28, and I have him at number 29. He goes straight into D tier. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is a quirky, weird aberration in U.S. history. A liberal from rural Georgia, Jimmy proverbially leaves the peanut farm to run for the White House. For almost every positive thing Carter accomplished, there's an almost equal and opposite mess up to counteract it. So he does come in with a strong vision for the U.S., and he had many strong principles, but he was an abysmal communicator, and he routinely flubbed communications with the public. He also kept his Georgia boys on payroll, so the team that helped him win the election were placed in critical government roles. And here's the rub. For all the talk of draining the swamp, when a president has 0 DC insiders, they actually have no idea how to run the government or get things done. That was Carter as president. He had no DC insiders and could get nothing done in Congress. His administration was also an operational mess. Carter couldn't delegate or create any order or structure within the White House. He ran the show in pure chaos, and over time that became apparent to the American public. On the flip side, he truly cared about the environment and almost prophetically pushed for climate action. And he also cared about the general welfare of the nation. Did he probably make some racist comments? Yes, that's also true. He had some incredible foreign policy achievements, like negotiating peace between Israel and Egypt, and this creates some semblance of stability in that region. And you might disagree with that statement, but without Carter, I think things would be much worse than they are now. He also negotiated pretty well with the USSR, but he got completely kneecapped by OPEC, and he could not negotiate a way out of the Iran hostage situation. Carter was unable to respond to crisis. He could not build alliances, and he gets poor marks for almost every major crisis that he faces. He, of course, has very high personal integrity and character, and at times he refused to play politics to the point of being naive and incompetent. He creates the EPA and Department of Education, and he gets some climate bills through the Congress, but at every step he's thwarted by a vindictive Ted Kennedy who wanted to be president. All in all, not great. Good intentions, poor execution. For his mediocre leadership, Jimmy Carter gets a score of 3.10. Historians have him at 23. Surprisingly, when you average out my ratings, he comes out at 17, which is driven by his strong integrity and vision. This puts him in the B tier. The sixth party system. With Ronald Reagan, we see yet another great realignment and the ushering in of neoliberalism. A backlash to the New Deal schema, this era is dominated by reductions in government regulation, taxation, and barriers to international trade. In short, it's a good time to be in business. Gambling on Wall Street and shipping American jobs abroad via outsourcing and offshoring become the prevailing wisdom of the era. This era is largely defined by what rights we should extend to different groups. With the New Deal and civil rights complete, Democrats look to shape social cultural issues through affirmative action, abortion rights, same-sex marriage. This is the beginning of an American religious Cold War. Republicans mobilize evangelicals, often called the religious right, to fight the socio-cultural agenda of the Democrats. In turn, Democrats increasingly calcify into an in-group, out-group orthodoxy based on identity. This is where the American empire overextends itself and begins its slow but steady decline in international influence. But it's also a remarkable period of stability, with 4 presidents serving 2 terms. If we look at the other party systems, we see that in the first party system, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe served 2 full terms. In the second, only Andrew Jackson serves 2 terms. In the third, Grant serves 2 consecutive terms, and Grover Cleveland serves 2 interrupted terms. In the fourth, only Woodrow Wilson serves 2 consecutive terms. In the fifth, only FDR and Eisenhower serve at least 2 consecutive terms. Yet in the sixth party system, almost every president has 2 terms. And for the first time since the first party system, no vice president prematurely becomes president. This is an era of stability, predictability, and conservatism. All of this is very topical because we're living through it right now. I feel pretty strongly that Obama was the final neoliberal president. I'm recording this in 2025, and my conclusion is that we've now entered into the 7th political system. Our matrix is currently reorientating itself. It feels chaotic to go through big change. So let's see how we got here. Ronald Reagan. Love him or hate him, Ronald Reagan creates the standard by which both parties measure themselves for 40 years. Reagan was a visionary. He had both a precise and poetic image of how the US should look inside and out. He was also an absolutely phenomenal communicator. His acting chops were an incredible asset in inspiring and motivating the American people. As an aside, Reagan couldn't comprehend how non-actors could be successful presidents. And we're hitting upon a key insight here. The president's job is to cast a vision, highlight some key priorities, and then hit them over and over again. Reagan was absolutely brilliant in manufacturing the image of the presidency, the theater of leadership. And a lot of leadership is exactly this, a theater play. I say this as a positive. I feel like Reagan gets dunked on for this, that he's just an actor, but the man creates a new coalition, reframes the concept of being American, and compels people into action. Putting on a tightly orchestrated show is part of the gig. And this is Reagan at his best. But from here, we now begin our descent. Reagan's policies were squarely focused on benefiting the ownership class. This class warfare was matched with a vigorous bigotry. The Reagan administration aimed to destroy the black family, demolish LGBT communities, and reverse feminist progress. He unnecessarily gutted environmentalist programs pushed by both Nixon and Carter. And in Reagan, we really see Nixon's true identity politics come alive. Favoritism and special interest groups emerge as a de facto ruling ethos. By creating separation and division, Reagan singled out groups he didn't like and went about making their life pretty shitty. Both the progressive era and the New Deal era focused on social programs that cut across identity. Child labor laws were not a white issue or a black issue. Social Security was not a men's issue or a women's issue. But with Reagan, we see the start of a fragmentation in the US electorate, something that Democrats of this era were all too happy to run with. It's no coincidence that intersectionality is a term that's coined in 1989. Reagan was solid in foreign policy. He played ball well with the USSR, although I think his contribution to ending the Cold War is overstated and underplays the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. In terms of crisis management, Reagan spent more time consoling than actually taking action. He only took real action if it benefited the ownership class. Otherwise, he kind of gave the middle finger to middle America and the working class. He actively ignored and worsened the HIV/AIDS crisis. Under Reagan, we get trickle-down economics, massive deficit spending, and the slashing of social safety nets. So we're spending way more money, but a lot less of it is going to actual people, which is a pretty raw deal for ordinary people. Domestic policy was all about tax cuts, while creating the conditions for offshoring manufacturing jobs. Massive inequality begins here. Many of the crises we're facing right now are due to the short-term greed implemented by the Reagan administration. And ultimately, under this charming grandpa exterior, he was a true Machiavellian. Reagan was ruthlessly selfish and determined. He surrounded himself with corrupt people. Following in Nixon's footsteps, he committed some light treason with Iran to win his election. He also illegally ran an international drug and weapons trade ring and subsequently tried to cover it up. Was Reagan a good leader? He had some really strong qualities, but ultimately he opened a Pandora's box of short-term Machiavellian greed that tanked the country. The failure of subsequent administrations to rein in this massive redistribution of wealth from ordinary people to the wealthy, coupled out with bleeding our national resources, is the reason the America First movement has gained so much support today. For his march towards oligarchy, Reagan gets a score of 2.93. Historians have him at number 18, and I have him at number 20, which is C tier. George H.W. Bush. I might shock you with my evaluation of George H.W. Bush. Let me give a caveat here. Starting with the George H.W. Bush administration, there is one big change in how I gathered data to evaluate leadership because, well, I was born. So I'm slowly shifting from just reading about history to having lived it. And try as I might, this of course flavors how I perceive and evaluate events. As mentioned at the top of this video, with each president going forward, we're running into the issue of time. We need at least 20 years to evaluate the impact of each leader. And often we can only really understand impact, context, and consequences after an even much longer time horizon. As we review the next 4 presidents, let us please practice some mutual grace and take some deep breaths. We're entering political and partisan waters. I guarantee that what we know about these presidents and how we evaluate them will continue to change with more time, space, and distance. So with that, let's go back to George Bush. Speaking of vice presidents, of the 15 vice presidents that went on to become president, only 3 of them were elected to immediately finish the job of their boss. John Adams was considered the rightful successor to Washington's federalism. Martin Van Buren continued many of Andrew Jackson's policy, and George H.W. Bush was brought on to carry the Reagan legacy. It's a lonely club. And how did Bush fare? Bush had very little vision. At best, he cobbled together kind of a sense of ad hoc policies, and he also wasn't a great communicator. He was solid in small crises, but thankfully, he was not severely tested. Bush also did engage in racist dog whistling during election time. But what's really interesting is he then reversed course on many of the Reagan culture wars. He made strides for women and Black Americans through executive appointments, cared for people with disabilities, and even passed legislation to benefit gay Americans during the AIDS crisis. Bush even passed environmental legislation. None of this is necessarily groundbreaking, but he took solid steps to create unity. His largest domestic achievement was passing the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was a massive leap forward in creating a greater, accessible America. Bush was considered an honest broker, and he had no corruption or scandals. His own party unfairly tore him apart for raising taxes, but to me, that shows that Bush was more of a pragmatist and responded to the moment. He was also very adept in foreign policy. He organized a true coalition for the Kuwait-Iraq War. He had a clear military objective and met it swiftly and effectively. He had a very good working relationship with the USSR and collaborated with Gorbachev as the USSR was dismantled. Bush was strangely pro-social, maybe even progressive as a president. He was not ideological, and he responded proactively and with pretty good execution. His policies benefited Americans of all backgrounds, and his handling of foreign policy was flexible and smart. A more passive or ideological president could have messed up the Cold War transition, but Bush managed the situation with skill. Honestly, I think Bush was a pretty damn fine leader. He was cast in a poor light because he, in essence, betrayed the Reagan vision, and then his legacy got unfairly hitched to the axe of his son. But I'd take a leader of H.W.'s caliber any day of the week. For his good but under the radar leadership, George H.W. Bush gets a score of 3.13. Historians have him at number 19, and I have him at number 15, which is a very respectable B tier. Bill Clinton. George H.W. Bush does not win re-election. Instead, we get Slick Willie, Mr. Bill Clinton. Oh boy, here we go. Clinton comes in with a lot of distinct policy ideas, but he had no overarching vision. Neoliberal Democrats turn more into technocrats and rule through special interests. In essence, let's pass legislation to make distinct voter groups happy. Clinton was more of a tactician, maybe a strategist, but even that might be stretching. He was definitely not any sort of visionary. Clinton was a solid communicator and downright charming in small forums, but he was not a great orator when it came to the public at large. Legislatively, Clinton made very small steps. He ran quite a risk-averse White House. He was more concerned with popularity than actually doing what was needed or right in the moment. Bill Clinton is a politician through and through. And time has shown that some of the legislation, like the crime bill, were downright awful. He was also pretty shitty in moments of crisis. His playbook was just attack, 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 but he could never really get a handle on things or lead decisively. Again, it's as if he's taking more of a public relations approach than a leadership approach. He gets some high marks for expanding the coalition and on paper, wanting to support gay Americans, black Americans, and women. But the steps he took to actually do something of substance were few and far between. I'd argue that Clinton starts the modern scourge of virtue signaling. He says the right stuff, but does very little to actually back it up. He gets his base very hyped up, but does not actually effectuate much change. Listen, the Republicans started identity politics by pandering to white voters, Southern strategy, Nixon, Reagan, but the Democrats really ran with it within their own coalitions. That's just how strong vision is in framing political debates. So try as they might, neoliberal Democrats were always reacting to Reagan. In foreign policy, Clinton kept things stable. He made a successful intervention during the breakup of Yugoslavia, but he also expanded NATO into Eastern Europe, of which the diplomatic fallout with Russia continues to be a super sensitive and hot topic today. I'm not saying the US is at fault for the current geopolitical shit show, and I'm not speaking about Russia's intentions or policies at all. But from a US policy perspective, Clinton made the game board we are now playing on at great cost in Eastern Europe. Finally, Clinton is just one of the sleaziest presidents in history. The Monica Lewinsky affair is obvious, but there's also other allegations of sexual harassment and assault, and these spilled directly into his governance. Newt Gingrich and the Republicans unfairly hounded Clinton with a viciousness that was unmerited. Their constant investigations into total nonsense distracted from real and pressing issues, and pointless, made-up investigations ironically drown out what's truly poor integrity in Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was a duplicitous liar. He surrounded himself with a cast of objectionable partisans, and he idolized Richard Nixon, for God's sake. He was no role model, and he makes my skin crawl. For his mediocre to poor leadership, he gets a score of 2.89. Historians have him at number 14, which is just much too high. I feel like this suffers from recency bias. I have him at number 21, which puts him in the C tier. George W. Bush. George W. Bush storms the political scene and in many ways steals the election to become president. Despite being his father's son, W. would not repeat his father's impressive tenure. Bush started his presidency without a clear vision, but all of that changed with 9/11. After the terrorist attack, Bush switched to a Wilsonian vision of mandated democracy around the world. And for the first time since the Cold War, the US had a clear international role again. Bush was obviously utterly inept at communicating. And I'm not even talking about the stuttering and the gaffes. The guy really could not explain his decision making to the public. Instead, he let everyone around him constantly frame the agenda. Bush talked a big game about compassionate conservatism, but his policies largely made the lives of minority groups worse off. While he himself did not engage in corruption, he surrounded himself with fanboys of crony capitalism who used the government to siphon money at an alarming rate. He also authorized torture at Guantanamo Bay and by most metrics committed war crimes. Speaking of foreign policy, he galvanized the American public for the invasion of Afghanistan, but then also unilaterally and on false premises invaded Iraq. Bush never set clear military objectives and created forever wars that cost the lives of millions and wasted trillions of dollars. Bush overextends the US and destroys our international alliances and credibility. He did do good work in Africa on HIV, which often gets overshadowed, but honestly, this makes sense given his colossal fuck-ups in the Middle East. Domestically, he's known for cutting taxes and deregulating the financial sector, which leads to a massive meltdown towards the end of his term. Which brings us to crisis leadership. George W. Bush was goddamn terrible in the face of crisis. He would often completely freeze and not respond in the moment of need. From 9/11 to Katrina to the financial crisis, he had no idea how to respond with any semblance of competence. Across the board, he was an awful leader who allowed special interests and powerful politicals to steer the ship away from the general welfare of the people. He's the only president weak enough to elevate his VP into a co-presidency role. He is responsible for war crimes, torture, and the death of the American empire. For his awful leadership, Bush gets a score of 2.14. Historians have him at number 33, and I have him at number 32. Straight to the D tier. I wouldn't be surprised if over time we see him fall even further to F tier when we have a better understanding of his long-term impact. Barack Obama. Finally, we arrive at our last president to be rated and ranked. Obama's score honestly surprises me every time I look at it, so let's get into it. This might be surprising to some, but Obama never had a compelling vision for the US, nor did he articulate what the role of the US should be at home or abroad. Obama was a cerebral strategist. He operated more from guiding principles and often felt more technocratic than visionary. This is the natural inheritance from the Bill Clinton playbook. Play to special interests, try to reward identity-based groups when public opinion favors it. Of course, Obama was a truly genius orator and one of the best communicators in US history. He inspired and lifted people up, made them feel real hope. But when it comes to unifying the nation, Obama cared when it was convenient, but was never proactively progressive. The Democrats started his term opposed to gay marriage and only had an evolution of consciousness when the public polls shifted. This is not leadership, this is politician 101. And many rural folks felt left behind and forgotten. Let's be clear, this did not start with Obama. Rural America was sold out by Reagan's neoliberal movement from the beginning, but Obama comes to shoulder much of the blame. Legislatively, Obamacare is his defining achievement, and while it was a big change, it was by no means transformative. It retooled the existing systems, but did not create a new one. The legislation also created unintended consequences that have exacerbated wealth inequalities and made it difficult for gig workers to get health insurance. Beyond that, Obama spent most of his presidency in congressional gridlock and got very little done. While he did pass some regulations of the financial sector, he did not actually reform the system in any meaningful way. And if you're a Democrat, you have to admit that Obama completely mismanaged and fucked up Supreme Court appointments. Again, a lot of virtue signaling at the expense of actually getting stuff done. In foreign policy, Obama continued to muddle through the wars in the Middle East, and despite winning the Nobel Peace Prize based on vibes alone, he has his share of blood on his hands. In many ways, he maintained the global status quo. I'm also curious to see how we evaluate his response to the Arab Spring in the long run. His lead from behind approach created a power vacuum, and we're still dealing with the aftermath today. Where Obama shines is in his crisis leadership. He moved quickly and with force to stop the financial system and broader US economy from completely imploding. But again, no meaningful reforms or accountability. He is absolutely a true role model with unimpeachable character, no scandals, and no corruption, which is genuinely impressive. To me, Obama represents the pinnacle of neoliberal Democrats. They talk a big talk, but walk a weak game. Their constant virtue signaling and special interest politics create one side of the coin of the culture wars. And in reality, they're still living in Reagan's America. They cannot reframe the debate or create a compelling narrative for the US. They favor technocratic and highly analytical styles of leadership, which are good at maintaining the status quo, but rarely move people to change. Although in my heart, I feel like he should be rated more towards the average, the numbers are the numbers. Due to his communication skills, crisis management, and integrity, Obama gets a score of 3.79. Historians have him at number 11, and I have him at number 7. Which is the top of A tier. So here we have it, 228 years of presidential leadership, rated, ranked, and sorted on a tier list. In a moment, I'm going to look at some super interesting patterns using statistics. That's the coolest part of this whole project. But for a moment, I'm going to speak from the heart. If nothing else, my hope is that for each president, we see that different leadership styles exist. And different styles have their unique strengths and hindrances. These styles must meet the times. Leadership is ultimately about adaptation. How do we evolve in this moment given what we are experiencing? The most dangerous form of leadership often comes from strong ideology. Our minds are incredibly powerful to the point of delusion. When we choose to live inside this delusion, we stop noticing what's happening all around us. That is the most dangerous position we can take. Powerful leaders shape the times by responding to the times. At their best, they create this balance, a sustainable equilibrium that serves us all. They create a common language and a way of seeing the world. We as citizens then live inside the frame that they create for us. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan were those leaders for the US. But leadership is not just presidential. Each day, we all must wake up and decide for ourselves what narratives we believe in, what actions we take, what values we uphold. Of course, the government has a large impact on our lives and represents society at large. But society is also in the interactions we have with each other, in schools, at work, at the grocery store. Every day, our actions, thoughts, feelings, and beliefs ripple out in a magnificent butterfly effect. We are America, me and you. There is no government without its people, no nation without its citizens. Let's take some inspiration from these men, grappling between self-interest and selflessness, grappling between power and force, between love and fear. These are universal dilemmas, not just for the men at top, but for each person who makes up our society. So you might be wondering, what can we learn from this whole project? Are there any patterns? I'm glad you asked. We now turn to question number 2. Using statistics, what's actually important for presidential performance? After collecting all of this data, I wondered, are there some factors that are more important than others? Is communication really as important as responding to a crisis? And that's how I started down the rabbit hole of statistics. But there's one major problem we need to tackle before we get to the results. To see what correlates with great presidential performance, we once again must ask ourselves, what does great even mean? We need a quote-unquote objective measure, but no such objective measure exists. Historians are constantly updating their ratings and rankings, not because they get new information, it's because our values change over time. And so we interpret and reinterpret history to match what we care about right now. Like if you care about indigenous rights right now, then Andrew Jackson is the devil reincarnate. If you care about disability rights, then George H.W. Bush is pretty based. If there's one takeaway from this whole project, it's that what we value changes over time, and the stories we tell ourselves about the past change as well. There is no objective truth when it comes to history. Like an orchestra, we choose the volume of certain instruments over others to match what we like. So maybe it's just all vibes after all. What we choose to elevate is just a mirror of who we are right now. There is only the present moment. So to do this analysis, I chose the only measure I have, which is Siena College's poll of historians. It's not an objective measure of what good looks like. It's just a measure of what we value as good in the year 2025. So I began by looking at my 7 leadership criteria. Which of these had a statistically significant impact on how historians rank the presidents? Surprisingly, 4 of my criteria seem to be completely useless. Foreign policy does not matter. Domestic policy does not matter. Communication does not matter. National unity does not matter. That leaves us with 3 leadership criteria that have a statistically significant impact. Having a strong vision, managing crises, having strong integrity. So if you're looking to vote for a great president, find these 3 criteria. Okay, but there are surely more factors at play here, right? What about economic factors or past experience? Glad you asked. Once again, I've got you covered. In addition to leadership, I then added 5 more categories to this analysis. I chose to look at demographics, past professional experiences, the amount of crises they face in office, economic conditions, and political ideology. All in all, I ran regressions with almost 50 subfactors, looking at them in every single way I could. So first we're going to look at each category independently, like we did for leadership, and then we're going to look at all these categories together. And we're going to put together a model to see what really correlates with great presidential leadership. So once again, a quick recap. Within leadership, there's already 3 factors that correlate with presidential success. And these are having vision, crisis management, and great integrity. Then within demographics, I took a look at the total amount of years they spent in office, their age entering office, their age exiting office, the state that they're from, their geographic region, and their geographic division as defined by census data. Of all these factors, absolutely none made any difference. So we crossed this category off our list. All right, but what about their past experience? Surely what they've done in the past might influence how they act now, right? So what if they were formerly in business, or they were in the military, in the House of Representatives, or in the Senate? What if they were a governor, a cabinet member, vice president, or maybe they were even a general in the military? And the result is none of these made a difference when looking at past experience on its own. This really surprised me because I've always had a hunch governors make better presidents, but I guess that's not true. But there is an asterisk here, because in a bit, when we combine all the subfactors into one super analysis, one of these subfactors does become significant once more. But when we just look at them on their own, they're actually not statistically significant. Cross this category off as a whole. Now we look at the crises that can make or break a presidency. Within crises, I went through all of US history and looked at pandemics, rebellions, economic crises, natural disaster, war, foreign policy crises, domestic policy crises, and then the total number of crises. Interestingly enough, we finally have a winner here. The one crisis that correlates with a better presidential score is war. The old adage still holds true. In a vacuum, war helps presidents increase their rankings. Pandemics, rebellions, coups, recessions, natural disasters, these do not exert a strong enough influence to sway presidential rankings in either direction. What about the economy? Every election we hear, it's the economy, stupid. So I looked at unemployment, GDP, and inflation. And between these three subfactors, we have a winner once more. And it is inflation. In a vacuum, inflation tends to hurt presidential rankings. GDP and unemployment were not found to be significantly correlated with presidential performance in either direction. The irony here is that presidents seldom have direct influence over inflation, but it is a cautionary tale for those in power. What about political ideology? Okay, to be fair, this is the flimsiest data that I gathered. I decided to use a really flawed framework. You love it, you hate it, it's the political compass. And to make it even more sus, I used Mr. Beat's ratings from a few years ago. Look, I've got problems with the framework, I've got big problems with the questions on the test, and I've even got some disagreements here and there with how Mr. Beat answered the questions. But short of me doing every single test on my own, this is the best data I could find. In particular, the reason I wanted to use this political compass is because there's one academic paper I read that kept me up at night. Its central argument is that there's only one factor that actually determines presidential rankings, and that one factor is just how much power each president uses. When presidents use power, we remember their actions and impact much more. They get Hall of Fame achievements like Social Security or Obamacare. So I really wanted to test this out. I looked at the power scale, which runs from authoritarian to libertarian. I did regression analysis on both the Siena College historian rankings and my own leadership rankings. What did I find? For both historians and my own rankings, there was no statistically significant correlation between power and ranking. So this bias does not appear in our collective understanding of great presidents. Now, what about the economic scale, which runs from more socialistic to capitalistic? To be honest, in the grand scheme of things, I find this scale weird because it's heavily biased towards our kind of current political paradigm. The whole socialism versus capitalism frame is very 1900s, which means presidents from the 1700s, 1800s, it makes little sense on this spectrum. And with the current realignment that we're in right now, I don't even know how much more sense this spectrum will make going forward. Here's where it gets interesting. For both historians and my rankings, there is a correlation here. Presidents that lean more quote unquote left or socialistic tend to have higher ratings. Presidents that lean more quote unquote right or capitalistic tend to have lower ratings. So let's try to figure this out. Is this a bias? Or is it that truly pro-social, for the people presidents get higher rankings than pro-business, pro-religious presidents? Historians are not exactly known for having a leftist bias. And I'm about to break a lot of rules right now, so fuck it. But I aggregated up all of these scores, with left scores represented in negative for the left axis and right scores represented in positives for the right axis. So I added all of it up and I got a net score of plus 27.5, which means on the whole, we have a lot more right, pro-corporate, pro-religious, pro-tradition politicians in the White House. It's possible, this is just a hypothesis, that the bias for pro-social presidents is because they act to bring us back to center. When I plotted these ideological scores on a timeline, the left swings have often been a correction for rightward swings. And again, we're using a pretty bad framework with bad questions scored by only one individual. I would take this with a huge grain of salt. It's one area where more research is needed. So far, we've looked at each one of these categories in a vacuum on their own. But what happens when we start to look at them together? So from all these 50 subfactors, so far, we've narrowed down to a few. That is vision, integrity, crisis management, war, inflation, and pro-social ideology. But can they hang together? For those that know statistics, we know that once we introduce all variables at once, our model often looks different because it's possible these subfactors overlap with each other, so they might cancel each other out. What happens when we look at all 50 subfactors all at once? what does our model look like? Interestingly enough, crisis management disappears. My hypothesis is that it overlaps too much with war. Interestingly, inflation disappears as a factor as well. So this is what remains. Here are the factors in terms of their impact, from strongest to weakest. War is considered the biggest determinant of a high presidential ranking. Having a strong vision is next, and almost as significant as war. Next comes having high personal character integrity, and not far behind is having a pro-social ideology. But there's actually one past job experience that reemerges as relevant, and having this previous job experience is actually a negative. The model finds that businessmen are worse presidents. When we combine these 5 elements, we see that this model accounts for almost 83% of the variance in historian rankings, which is not bad at all. If we're looking for a great president, barring going off and starting a new war, we should be looking for vision, integrity, pro-social leadership, and not a businessman. Now we arrive at another big question. Is US leadership getting better or worse over time? Let's break it down by leadership capability, and then we're going to look at the big picture. I'm using a quadratic trend line to smooth out the data here. Vision. In terms of having a vision for the nation, we can see that after Washington and Jefferson, we go into a steep decline. If it wasn't for Lincoln and Grant, we would be pretty effed. We're quite lucky that for about 80 years, from FDR through Reagan, we had a clear national vision. Vision is so important because it creates a shared reality and organizes us to go somewhere together. Without a vision, we're just drifting along. Since Reagan, we've seen a decline in vision. We're now at average, which means we're kind of moving things along, but not really shaping our own destiny. Communication. Communication is vital because it's how the vision makes it to the people. It's how we know what's actually going on, why decisions are being made, and again, it helps us organize where are we going. On the whole, we've been quite average in communications. Jefferson, Lincoln, FDR, JFK, Reagan, Obama, they're really pulling their weight here. And what's interesting is despite Obama's strong rhetorical skills, we see a sharp downturn in this leadership capability. Our leaders are getting worse at speaking to us, inspiring us, making things make sense. I truly don't know how long we can continue without a cohesive, inspiring message. Add in our fractured media landscape, and this is a big concern for me. Integrity. The US is lucky to overall have leaders with high integrity. There is a lot less overt corruption than we might imagine. Things are usually so good that the media has to manufacture fake PR crises and make up fake scandals to sell the news. But there is a worrying trend kickstarted by Nixon, which we haven't seen since around the Civil War. We've seen just how important character and integrity are to presidential performance. So my deep desire is that we continue to pick candidates that uphold the rule of law and walk the walk. To be honest, this one doesn't look so good in 2025, but here's hoping we can start to turn this one around. National unity. In terms of unifying the nation, not playing favorites, and running the country in the best interest of everyone, we see that the lead up to the Civil War was pretty damn bad. Of any chart that I have, this one most clearly shows why the country was torn apart. Since the Civil War, we've been on a long march towards expanding the rights and privileges of every American, regardless of their identities. Past trends do not predict the future, but this chart does give me hope. The march to freedom is often much too long and much too costly, but we have gone step by step towards a more representative nation. Foreign policy. It's not a huge surprise that for a nation that consistently flirts with isolationism, we don't have high foreign policy scores. It was really FDR and Truman that birthed the American hegemony. And since then, we've only managed to squander our international leadership. Of all the charts that I've made, this is the strongest indicator to me that if we believe in something called the American Empire, that is in decline. We either do not want to or are incapable of being the leader of the quote-unquote free world. Depending on your ideological views, that might be great news or it could be scary. Domestic policy. We can see clearly just how poorly the nation was run before the Civil War. Again, we benefited from very strong leadership in domestic policy from the progressive era through the New Deal era. What's interesting is the neoliberal era ushered in by Reagan. We can see polarization is clearly displayed with Democrats moving to pass domestic legislation and Republicans acting to slow or stop changes in the Congress. But for all the talk of obstructionism, we're actually in a big upswing. The highs might not be as high, but progress is being made. If you are a doomer, this hopefully goes to show you in the long arc of history, things can actually turn out okay. Crisis. I've left crisis and crisis management for last. This is such an important area and one that impacts us all. But before looking at crisis management as a leadership capability, I want to actually look at the number of crises that each president has faced. What we see is a marked increase in the number of crises in the United States. Remember, this includes pandemics, rebellions, economic recessions and depressions, natural disasters, wars, foreign policy crises, and domestic policy crises. You'll have noticed that when I was reviewing each president, my reviews were getting longer and longer as time went on. This isn't just a factor of recency bias. The world and the presidency are getting much more complex. And this increased complexity is a breeding ground for error, crisis, and disaster. Crisis is such an important topic that I started a consulting company that focuses on leadership and crisis. I've written a book on leadership and crisis. This is one of the most important topics of our time. If you want to do a deep dive on crisis, my company, 3P Coaching and Solutions, has hundreds of videos on this topic. But here's a really simple explanation. Systems want to find balance. In the body, we call this homeostasis. It's an equilibrium. In a dynamic world with infinite variables, the order we establish can't stay forever. At some point, order slides more and more into disorder. This is a natural process. Chaos is just a signal that we need to change and adapt. We adapt to find a new equilibrium, a new status quo. However, when we resist, ignore, avoid, fight change, we create conflict. It's this conflict that is the defining feature of crisis. Crisis is nothing but an indicator that we're resisting change. So when we look at the graph and see crisis is escalating, what we're seeing more and more is signals that we're fighting change. Something is out of balance, and until we can resolve it, the slaps will come harder and harder, faster and faster. Regardless of party, the vast majority of Americans live conservatively. Republicans are afraid of losing religious and traditional values, afraid of losing a business-friendly environment. Democrats are increasingly afraid of losing rights for minority groups, losing global hegemony, afraid of losing a business-stable environment. Everyone is afraid and wants to freeze things at a particular moment in time. Change is terrifying. Most Americans just want to chill and enjoy the illusion for a bit longer. But the universe does not care about comfort. Crisis is nature's way of waking us up, and the hits will only get worse until we do wake up. Something isn't working. Will we have the courage to adapt? Now, it's all not bad news, because with the increase in crisis has also come a moderate increase in crisis management skills. It's not huge, but it's a bit of hope. Overall leadership. Taken all together, we can see that U.S. leadership declined from George Washington through Abraham Lincoln. We are fortunate to hit a great overall streak, which peaked around FDR. Since then, we have seen a decline in leadership performance. This is alarming and something that does need to be addressed. I've dedicated my life and staked my livelihood on this exact matter. Crisis is coming, and we need strong leadership to face it. So now let's take a look at what might happen in the future. Our final question: what does the future of presidential leadership look like? I'm often asked, do the times make the man, or does the man make the times? Man and time make each other. Leadership is a social process, meaning leadership is actually a relationship. A fascist needs a groundswell of popular opinion to thrust them into power, but only a fascist can organize and feed the masses. They need each other to exist. Leadership is how we relate to ourselves, to each other, to the environment. So it's not a role, it's not a trait, and it's not authority. Leadership is ultimately about how we dance with the situation, how we respond in the moment. And tough times are ahead. And not because of some stupid platitude about soft men and hard men. Tough times are ahead because we're resisting change. We're propping up old systems and old order that no longer serves the whole. Change is the only constant. Our decision is whether we walk alongside gracefully or get dragged through the mud forcefully. No one knows what the future has in store. We've really forgotten that the world is a dynamic, unpredictable, complicated place. The trend arrows show a nation without a strong vision in an uncertain role in the world order. But we've also expanded rights for Americans and passed meaningful domestic policies. Yes, we also see a dizzying increase in the amount of crises, begging us to change. But data can never tell us where we're going. For that, we need one thing: leadership. When I talk about leadership, I'm once again not just talking about the person in the White House. For all of these crises, they're gonna hit us at home. The person in the White House will not stop a hurricane or a pandemic or inflation. We're each asked to learn the dance of change. We're each asked to step up and embrace the leader within. If you're looking where to start, well, the presidents have given us some clues. Learn how to create a real vision, to create your own principles and values and sense of direction. Learn integrity, to live by those values and embrace honesty with all your passion. Learn how to care for your fellow man, to embrace community and service, and learn how to change, to sense the subtle shifts in our relationships and respond accordingly. This is adaptation, and this is the future. No one is coming to save us. We, me and you, are the leaders we've been waiting for. The question is, will we have the courage to try?